Chapter 18 of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. This recording is in the public domain. Hedged in. "I don't live so far away that I need to ride home," said Miss Hunter, as she climbed into the carriage. "But then I have to go away down street, not far from where you live, and I would rather ride than walk if it is agreeable to you. But I think you must be mistaken in the person. I am nothing in the world but an old maid, who gets her living by sewing for the tailors, day in and day out. I'm not likely to be the sort of person you would choose for a friend." Miss Wainwright surveyed her guest reflectively. "Why not?" she asked at last. "I'm an old maid myself. I may have a little more money than you, but I don't know as I am any worse on that account, if I use it properly. Aren't we at work for the same Master? The command to me was to serve with all my heart and mind and soul, and to love my neighbor as well as I do myself. Are your orders any different?" "Not a whit," said Miss Hunter heartily. "I shouldn't wonder if we would agree. What are you trying to do?" "Everything. I can't center myself. I tried to, but new things come up every hour. I began with Peter, who drives my horses, but that very day I went to a picnic and got mixed up with a dozen people, who all seemed to belong to my work. Then I tried to locate my energies on John Hartzell, but here are these people this morning claiming my attention, and I find I am about as interested in Kate Hartzell as I am in her brother, though I am not sure that she is in need of any particular help. Then there are 2 or 3 boys, young men I suppose they call themselves, who interest me wonderfully, and so it goes. I'm all divided up. For the matter of that, the verse that started me is not very exclusive. 'Whatsoever ye do,' it said. The trouble is, while I am engaged in doing one thing, another springs up beside it that seems to need doing, and divides the interest." "I know," and Miss Hunter nodded, her bright eyes twinkling appreciatively. "I get led off that way myself; but there is one thing on which I am centered, and it has byways and lanes enough to keep me busy. I'm bound to fight rum, always and everywhere. In whatever form and among whatever people I find it, I am its sworn foe, pledged to circumvent it if I can." Miss Wainwright's smile was pleasant to see. "Then I know what Mr. Durant meant," she said. "Good! I'm with you. I complained of not having a helpmeet. We'll work together. Where do you live?" "Here," said Miss Hunter, glancing from the carriage. "That brown door with the old-fashioned lock on it is mine." It was not very far from the region known as the Flats, and was certainly not an improvement on them. Where that region was lined with filthy-looking homes and filthy children, this was lined with saloons and restaurants of the lower kind, and abounded in drunkards. "Here?" said Miss Wainwright, drawing back in dismay. "Couldn't you have done better than that?" "Oh, yes, I could. There was a clean little room on Webb Street where only decent people live. That I could have got. I sew for the man who owns it, and I could have had it at a bargain, and there's no denying that I wanted it. But I put that want down with some others, and told them to let me alone. I was coming just here to live, and nowhere else." "But why?" persisted Miss Wainwright. "It is a bad place for a woman alone, certainly. What made you think you ought to do such a thing?" "Well, now, I'll tell you. If you look up and down the street, you will see that there isn't a decent place, nor a safe one, for a tempted man, within a block on either side. They all sell rum in some form. This room was to be rented with the rest. There was as evil a looking man after it the day I rented it as ever I saw. He wanted to make a pool room of it. I thought it all over, the things I could do and the things I couldn't. If I had had money, I should have rented the room and fitted it up nice and homelike, and hired a nice homelike old man to come and keep it, and had it a bright, clean lounging place for the boys who were not so far astray but that they could appreciate its clean, bright looks and ways. But I hadn't the money, you see, and so I had to do the best I could. Oh, you needn't look shocked. I'm no would-be reformer trying to turn the world upside down, mixing white with black until a looker-on can't tell which is which. I remember that I'm a woman. I can't invite them in, poor fellows, and give them a pitying word now and then as I'd like to. I have to keep my doors closed and locked. But all day and all the evening I keep my shades up. There's a room upstairs where I sit and sew, but downstairs there isn't a soul to be seen, only a cheery fire in the grate, and a round table with a red cloth on, in the middle of the room, and a newspaper on it, and the big old Bible that my father used to read out of, and a rocking chair at the left, and a little smaller chair just the other side, both of them empty, and the room as bright as a good-sized lamp will make it. It's a picture, don't you see? I don't know how many poor fellows who stagger by had homes like it once, where maybe the mothers and fathers sat and waited for them. Sometimes I think it is a good thing that the chairs always have to be empty, because they will remind some of them all the plainer that the mothers and fathers are gone. Well, there I keep the room, looking as much like a picture of a neat plain home as I can, and I stretch the shades just as high as I can, and then I go upstairs and make buttonholes, and pray that the Lord will use the one clean place on this street, somehow, for his glory. I have to leave the how with him. But the chairs won't always be empty, I hope and pray. I want to get acquainted with wives and mothers, and get them to trusting me, and then when they come hunting their treasures who are lost in this street, I want them to learn to slip in here, and wait and watch, and if they can get hold of the husband or the son, to drop into this clean spot with him, and try to coax him back. I don't know what will come of it, I am sure. It is the best thing I could plan, and I'm trying it. I have only been here a month. The chairs haven't been used yet, only on Sundays. I use them then. I have a class of boys down at the mission chapel in the morning, and I coax them to drop in on Sunday afternoon. They won't stay at home, and home is such a dreadful place for them anyway, I suspect, so I coax them in. I want to have a little something to tempt them with, an apple or a bite of cake if I can manage it, or even a bit of candy now and then. They are young, poor fellows, and they have had none too much petting in their lives. There are only 4 of them. It is a queer way to work, I know, and maybe not over-wise, but I haven't seen any way clear to any other plan. I'm tired of folding my hands and waiting for folks who are wiser than I to give me something to do. When they get it ready, I'll help do it if I can, but while I'm waiting, I may as well work along in those ways that I can think of. I know they wouldn't do for everybody. I wouldn't take a class of little girls at the mission because I could not invite them to my house. It is no place for girls to come. But I am old and homely and decent, and almost everybody knows it. A woman of 50, without any family of her own, can do a dozen things that wouldn't have done for her at 20, you know. Miss Hunter had talked on rapidly, and Miss Wainwright had not been able to interrupt. At first because of her astonishment, and afterward because of a choking in her throat. She could not have explained what the thought of that clean little room shining out of that moral desert was to her. She made one comment only when the voluble voice ceased. "Such things take money. You may as well be glad that the silver and the gold are his. I'm sure I'm glad that he has made me one of his stewards." Then she told to Miss Hunter the story of the prayer meeting from its first inception up to this coming evening, when they hoped to gather for the first meeting. Miss Hunter listened and nodded, and asked questions and nodded again, and said with an emphatic voice, as the carriage stopped to let her down at the point she had mentioned, "Good, I'll be there. The thing grows, doesn't it?" As the carriage turned the corner, Miss Wainwright saw Mr. Cleveland coming toward them, and waited for him. "I wonder if you are the person I want to see," was her greeting. "There are 2 men who ought to find employment to-day, and the probability is that either Satan's stewards or the Lord's will furnish it for them. The question is, which?" "I've engaged for life with the latter," Mr. Cleveland said. "Who are they, and what can they do? Can you recommend them?" "For what? Honesty and sobriety and industry? No, I can't. I don't know anything about their honesty, and I know they will not be likely to keep sober all day unless some force outside of their weak wills is brought to bear on them. And as for industry, they may have forgotten how to work, for all I know. but for being sorely tempted souls who have a faint desire to live different lives from what they have of late, I can recommend them. Wasn't that as much as could be said of you, Mr. Cleveland, when the Lord took hold of you?" "Quite as much," he said gravely. "I am ready to do what I can for them on that recommendation." There followed a conference as to ways and means, and Miss Wainwright went home, to get ready for the evening. I do not think that the faith of one reached so far as to expect John Hartzell to be among the number who attended that Saturday evening prayer meeting. Yet he was there. Not that he had intended it. It was one of those singular combinations of apparently trivial things of which we speak when we say it happened thus and so. John Hartzell had found work the remainder of that day in Mr. Cleveland's own grounds, under his watchful eye. He had taken his supper there, a most bountiful one, intended to quiet, as much as food and drink could do it, the cravings of an unnatural appetite. He was still there when Mr. Cleveland's man Peter went for the afternoon mail, and Lloyd McLean just happened to raise his eyes as the man was helping himself at the lock box, and said, "I suppose you don't know anything of the whereabouts of a fellow named Hartzell, do you? Here is a letter for him." So the letter had gone up in the late mail, and had been handed to John as he arose from the supper table. Beautiful writing. John Hartzell, Esquire. I don't suppose you have any idea what a strange sensation the name thus written gave to the fallen man. He sat down in the rustic chair on the back piazza, and read the letter. Mr. Cleveland came toward him just as it was concluded. He arranged for future days' works, and complimented John on his faithfulness that afternoon, and asked him finally if he would stop at Miss Wainwright's on his way home with a basket of choice apples that his mother wished to send her. He thought of the prayer meeting, it is true, but decided that it would not do to invite John to attend. John Hartzell carried the apples, and Keziah, as she opened the door to him, happened to remember that Miss Wainwright had said that afternoon, "If I could see John Hartzell, I would give him this box to carry home, just as it is. There are a dozen things in it his wife would find useful." So Keziah said, "Wait a minute, Miss Hannah wants to see you." And Miss Wainwright, on being summoned, was thrilled with a sudden hope, and said, "Oh, John Hartzell! I don't know but the Lord has sent you here at this very minute. If you honestly want to be a man, as you told me you did, only yesterday, come in and stay with us this evening. We have met to pray for you." John, old friend, will you do this for me for the sake of old times? If you hear of a prayer meeting anywhere on Saturday evening, won't you go to it? It was in a prayer meeting that I got just the help I needed, help which has lasted ever since. That was one sentence in John's letter. He remembered the words distinctly. He had sneered over them in a sad, hopeless kind of way. The idea of his hearing of a prayer meeting! He did not believe, in the first place, that there was such a thing in Eastwood, and, in the second place, how would it be possible for him to know anything about it? And as for going, the people would think him crazy. Yet here was the prayer meeting, and here was his invitation to enter. It gave John Hartzell a strange feeling, as of one surrounded, hedged in by some solemn, unseen force. Theoretically, he was acquainted with God. He had a general knowledge of the orthodox belief in the presence in this world of the Holy Spirit, and in his power over hearts. Was God calling John Hartzell? Almost like one dazed, and, without a word in reply, he pulled off his shabby hat, and followed Miss Wainwright into the parlor, where, by the south window, sat his wife and sister. Chapter 19 of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Parallels. Meantime, the conversation which was being held in Miss Wainwright's parlor was not such as is usual at prayer meetings. For that matter, it was not yet the hour for meeting, and some remark of Miss Hunter had drifted the talk into the channel which led Mr. Jerome Morrow, who was a member of the same church with Mr. Cleveland, to ask this question. "That sounds, sir, as though you wanted to make the temperance question a party issue. Would you cast your vote in that line?" "Would I vote for a thing that I have prayed for 6 years, do you mean? What would you think of my praying if I did not?" "Ah, but that is begging the question, isn't it? A man might pray for a thing, and yet honestly believe that the time had not come to get it." "Certainly he might. But if he had prayed for a man to help him in the direction of deliverance, and the day came when the man stood at the door, ready to help, if only some one would unlock it and let him in order to be consistent, wouldn't I have to help unlock it?" "But if you were sure you couldn't unlock it," Mr. Morrow said, smiling, but taking up the metaphor, "and meantime there was another door and another man that the best class of people were willing to let in, shouldn't you throw your help where it will tell?" "You need 3 doors to that building," said Miss Hunter, her keen eyes flashing appreciation of the coming argument. Both gentlemen laughed. "Very well," said Mr. Morrow, "let us have 3 doors, a man at each. The third man neither you nor I approve. For the sake of the argument, we will say that of the 2 you prefer the second man, and that you have good reason to believe that if you will unite your strength to mine, we can open the door for him, but if you will persist in your first choice, you will accomplish nothing for your man, and hinder me, and give the third door the right of way. That is the way the thing looks to me." And the gentleman sat back, well pleased with the clearness of his position. "I will grant your statements, so far as you have gone," Mr. Cleveland said, speaking with the quiet assurance of one who had been taken over this ground a great many times, and was familiar with every foot of the way. "But there are certain important considerations which you have omitted. I am a Christian, and must look at this, as well as at everything else, from a Christian standpoint. I see, from my position, a giant wrong standing in the way, blocking the wheels of the gospel of Christ, slaughtering souls whom Christ died to save. The man whom I would admit is pledged against this wrong, has been working for years to rid the country of it. For the sake of argument, we will say that the man whom you would admit winks at it, turns his back on efforts to suppress it. The third man boldly admits it into the country as one of its institutions. Now, in the sight of God, I am pledged to stand by the right. If I honestly believe this giant wrong to be the force which the Christian world is called to put down, I must in every possible way give my push. I may not be strong enough to move the giant a single inch. He may laugh at me for the attempt. I may need your help and your neighbor's help to do this thing. If neither of you will give it to me, if instead you persist in tugging at that middle door and fail, on whom does the responsibility rest, because the country is left to the third man? On me, who, in all good conscience, before God, gave my push where I solemnly believe he told me to? Or on you who said, "This right thing cannot be done now, so we will do one thing which is a little wrong, in order to save ourselves from that which is a good deal wrong"? Does it never occur to you that if a great company of you should do the thing which is perfectly true and right, there would be no danger from the third door? "But I do not accept your premises," said Mr. Morrow, with a touch of irritation in his voice. "I do not say that the vote I would cast is a little wrong. I believe it to be the best one which can be cast." "Very well, if you have gone to God for light, and you believe in all sincerity that this is what he would have you do, I don't urge you to the contrary. The fact is, my friend, if you do not believe intemperance to be a great sin, and the selling of alcohol to be a monstrous crime, there is no argument between us." "But I do think just those things. I am as strong a temperance man as that. I would be glad if there were never to be another drop of the stuff sold. What I say is that we can gain nothing by pushing in that direction now, because we know there are not enough of us, and we can lose a great deal." Mr. Cleveland shook his head. "Untenable ground, my friend. If this thing is wrong, and you and I do what we can toward removing it, we have nothing to do with the results. Let the men who see the wrong, and refuse to add their strength to overthrow it, shoulder the awful responsibility of failure. It is certainly removed from us. The other day I heard a woman telling that down in Watervale, where Mr. Durant was working last spring, there had been more liquor drank this summer than ever before. She said the saloon keepers were so angry about the temperance excitement that they just gave away their liquors for weeks, treated everybody who came in, and started some men to drinking who had been sober before. And she gave it as her opinion that an excitement which produced such results did more harm than good. It was Miss Hunter's clear, firm voice that made this statement. Mr. Morrow looked over at her with a sudden gleam of interest. This sounded like an ally for his side, from an unexpected quarter. "I should think that there could not be two opinions about that," he said quickly. Mr. Cleveland laughed. "I like to hear such arguments," he said. "It would seem as though their utter absurdity would give us recruits from the other side. Imagine the soldiers in the Revolution folding their hands and letting the enemy alone, because every attempt on their part roused a volley of shot from the other side and killed and wounded some of ours. What an independence our country would have achieved had the war been managed on such principles." "Then the Bible is mistaken when it says, 'By their fruits ye shall know them.' I am sure, from Miss Hunter's statement, the fruits of that temperance effort were anything but cheering." Mr. Cleveland's opponent was evidently growing cross, but Mr. Cleveland himself was perfectly at ease. "I think the verse holds true, Mr. Morrow. It applies to Satan's kingdom as well as to the Master's. You would hardly mean to be understood that you think these were the fruits of the temperance effort, would you? I understand them to be the fruits of Satan's rage against the work. The heathen rage still, and will doubtless continue to do so for years to come, unless, indeed, God's people fall into line and accept him as their leader, instead of trying to find a more expedient way." Mr. Morrow moved restlessly in his chair. He was a younger man than Mr. Cleveland; in fact, had but just begun to vote at all, and of course he was of the opinion that wisdom would die with him. "But do you mean to be understood that expediency has nothing to do with the affairs of this country? I beg your pardon, but I think that thing is nonsense. Of course, one must determine whether, all things considered, this is the wise way to take for the country's good. Why, the Bible says that even God winked at the times of men's ignorance. We must use common sense in these matters, and go no further than the people will go with us. What is the use of leading where people will not follow?" Then he had the benefit of a pair of searching eyes fixed fully on him for at least a minute before Mr. Cleveland spoke with deliberation. "Do you really mean to use God's forbearance as a ruler, his infinite patience with ignorance, to prove that a man who is not ignorant may do what is just a little wrong, in order to avert what he conceives to be a greater wrong?" "But I say it is not wrong. I tell you I deny the premises." Mr. Cleveland smiled. He began to realize that he was arguing with a man who was dancing around in a peck measure and forever coming back to the same point. "Very well," he said, "then there is no argument between us, I suppose. If it is honest ignorance on your part, you having done all you could for enlightenment, God will forgive you. Of course, I fail to see how you can pray that intemperance may be banished from our land, because your actions say that you consider that question of minor importance. There are others before which it must give way." To all this talk Lloyd McLean had been an amused listener. He had not reached the point where he considered his own convictions very strong in any direction. But he offered the next suggestion. "I am not very well posted in biblical literature, I confess, but isn't there such a thing recognized, even by Christians, as expediency?" He was looking directly at Mr. Cleveland, and that gentleman answered him. "Undoubtedly there is, but it is where there is no moral question involved. I think you will fail to find an instance in the Bible which can be made to say, 'This thing is right, but then there are difficulties involved. It will open the way for things which are not right, therefore I will do what is wrong in order that this other wrong may be avoided.' How would this method of reasoning have worked in the old days? Imagine those 3 Hebrews being interviewed by certain of their friends after the image had been set up on the plains of Dura. "Now, Shadrach," says one, "I sympathize with you in this matter. You know I do. I don't believe in bowing down before that detestable image any more than you do. But don't you see the time has not yet come for us to assert ourselves? We have enemies, and they are in league with the king. As surely as you insist on defying that command, you will be thrown into the fiery furnace. Nor will that be all. The whole affair will incense the king against our people, and any effort that we might make towards religious freedom would be set back for years. Don't you see you would do no good, but incalculable harm? Cannot you hear the discussion? I can seem to see the whole thing. But, says Shadrach, this thing is a sin. It is forbidden by our God. Oh, we know it is a sin. We are not apologizing for it for a moment. We are just trying to show you that the time has not come to touch it, and that an effort to do so would result only in harm. What we advise is, that you drop down on your knees at the sound of the music, and appear to worship with the rest. Our God looks at the heart, you know, and he will understand that it is just a matter of expediency." Mr. Morrow at this point interrupted the speaker. "Do you really profess, Mr. Cleveland, that you think you have drawn a case parallel to the issues of which we are speaking?" "Sufficiently parallel for my purpose and illustration," Mr. Cleveland said pleasantly. "I am not holding any argument with the honest heathen who believe it is right to bow before the image. It is only with those who are in sympathy with Shadrach and his friends, but who think the time has not yet come to act, that I am arguing. Oh, there are points that do not match the figure, of course. You do not need to be reminded that such illustrations are not perfect." "If one could be as sure of results as the old Hebrews were, it might do," Lloyd McLean said, musingly. Mr. Cleveland turned to him. "They were not certain, my friend." "Not? I told you I was not very well posted, but I thought they were." "Not at all. One of the grandest reaches of human faith shines forth in their 'but if not.' Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. We know that our God is able. Our faith takes in that fact, but if this is not his will, and we are to glorify him by defeat, so be it. We will not do wrong to save ourselves or our nation." Whereunto this argument would have tended will not be known, for at this point Miss Wainwright, who had been called from the room some moments before, returned, and following her was John Hartzell. There was almost consternation on some faces when the man who shambled in after their hostess was recognized. For what purpose had he come? Mr. Cleveland was the first to recover himself, and to announce that it was the hour for opening the meeting, and Lloyd McLean, having an open hymn book passed promptly to him, with a finger pointing to the number, at once began to sing. It was a meeting to remember, yet the thing which made it especially memorable was what seemed to the listeners a mistake. "I think," said Mr. Morrow, when the conversation as to ways of working for temperance had become somewhat general, "I think that our hope rests with the young. We have spent a great deal of time and money on hopeless cases. We ought to turn our attention almost exclusively to our young men, and save them. Save them before they are in apparent danger. It is only occasionally that a man who has become an habitual drunkard reforms." Everybody instantly thought of John Hartzell, and everybody wished that Mr. Morrow would not speak such words as these. They might be sadly true, they were certainly sadly out of place. Why couldn't the man think that perhaps he was stabbing a lately formed resolve in the breast of one of those hopeless ones? Mr. Cleveland glanced in John's direction. His head was drooping, and his whole attitude said, "Yes, I am one of them. I know that my case is hopeless." "Brother Morrow," it was Mr. Cleveland's voice, "I beg your pardon for interrupting, but I want to challenge what that seems to say. I know you do not mean to limit the power of God. yet we must be careful how we seem to do it. There have been many cases which men call hopeless whom God has saved. We should not have had a John B. Gow if someone had not worked and prayed and waited and tried again and again. Look at Durant, the temperance worker. He was one of the hopeless drunkards. He heard a man say of him, "That fellow would be hardly worth saving if it could be done, and it can't." I tell you we talk too much about hard cases and hopeless cases unless we mean on the human side. God is supreme in power, and the man who is willing to be saved can be, no matter how low he has fallen. He spoke rapidly, growing eager as he talked. He wanted John Hartzell, and John Hartzell's wife, and John Hartzell's sister, to take in the strength of this thought. No man can fall so low that I cannot pray and work hopefully for him, because he may be one who is to show us the power of God in the world, mighty to save, as mighty today as it ever was. He looked over at Kate as he spoke. She had grasped the thought in its fullness. It could be seen in her face. Her eyes were shining like stars. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. One of the hopeless cases. She came over to him the moment the meeting closed, her eyes still shining, her voice tremulous with suppressed feeling. "Mr. Cleveland, do you mean all that you seemed to say? Do you think no one is hopeless utterly?" "I believe it from my soul, all that I said, and all that I seemed to say. I believe that we have no right to single out any human being, and say of him, 'This is a hopeless case.' We recognize the folly of such judgments even while we speak, and are apt to qualify our words by adding, 'Humanly speaking, it is hopeless.' Humanly speaking, all cases are hopeless. But in the sight of God those may be near the rock who seem to us the most hopeless. So, Miss Hartzell, don't you allow yourself for one moment to limit the power and the grace of a Saviour. Remember, He is mighty to save." He was thinking all the time of John Hartzell. He had been thinking of him all the evening, praying for him, planning for him. That man hopeless, with his shapely head which told him of dormant brain power. Young still, and strong physically. What folly to think of him as hopeless! "Well, then," said Kate, her voice eager, "I claim you. I ask you to pray in faith and in hope for my father. Will you?" For her father? Old Joe Hartzell, broken in body and in mind, shattered beyond hope of recovery, apparently. He had not thought of the father. All his plans had been centered on the son. Would his logic fit that weak, gray-haired old man who had been drinking steadily for so many years? The daughter was watching him. "Yes," he said firmly, "I will pray for him." He did not say with what degree of faith. "When you said, 'No man can fall so low that I cannot pray and work hopefully for him, because he may be the one who is to show us the power of God in the world,' I thought at once of father, and it seemed to me you must mean him. He has fallen very low. I want to make a confession, Mr. Cleveland. He has seemed hopeless to me. In all my recent plans and efforts, I find I have meant John and not father. I have looked upon him as one who was impossible even for God to save. It looks dreadful to me to night that I ever could have thought so. I thank you for your words, more than I can express. They have opened my eyes. I will never put him aside as hopeless again. But I said to myself that it must be such as you, who had always honored God with strong faith, whose prayers he would hear. I want you to pray for my father." As she turned away, Mr. Cleveland said to himself that he would go home and go on his knees and ask God for faith enough to bring old Joe Hartzell to the one who was mighty to save. He would not say to the daughter now that he, too, it seemed, was limiting that mighty power. Kate laid her hand on Miss Wainwright's arm. "Will you pray for my father?" This was all she said. "For your father?" said Miss Wainwright, startled. "I thought it was for your brother." "It is both of them. You will not leave father out? Say you will not, Miss Wainwright, because I have done it. I have felt until to night that he was almost hopeless." "Well," said Miss Wainwright, "I will try. I don't know your father. I shall have to find him out and do for him, if I take him. I can't pray for a person at arm's length, never could, unless something beyond my reach kept us apart. We will do our best. Working and praying go together. And that reminds me. Did you mean you had gone down there to live altogether? How do you manage it? There can't be much money coming in." "I have a trade," said Kate, with faltering lips. She was being brought back suddenly to the hard realities of the life she had assumed. "I have been taught the dressmaker's trade. I thought if, after a while, I could get some work to do, it would help." Miss Wainwright nodded, a gleam of light in her gray eyes. "Just so," she said. "Things are bound to match in this world a great deal better than you have any idea of when you begin to bungle at them. I was thinking of that poor mother and the children she has left. They need clothes of all sorts, dresses and everything else, and I dare say there are plenty of others who do. I'm not worth much at sewing, never was. I can't sit still long enough to accomplish anything. But I'll tell you what I can do, pay other people for their work. We'll have a partnership. I'll furnish material and pay for the work, and some of those poor things will do the wearing. I begin to see daylight." Kate could only smile in answer. She would not have trusted her voice just then. Miss Wainwright's ways of working were peculiar, certainly. Meantime, the other workers in this drama of life were in the usual state of unconsciousness as to how they were to fit in. To Holly Copeland the evening began in disappointment. You will possibly remember that he was to have accompanied Mildred to the temperance prayer meeting. He came to her with troubled face a little before the hour of meeting. So sorry he was. His face and voice showed this as well as words. Father had been sent for to go out of town, and there were 2 packages of medicine, with directions, both of which must be delivered at once, and the people lived as far away from Miss Wainwright's as they well could, and he must be the messenger. Mildred was sympathetic. Sorry not to have his company, but he must not mind, since he had so important a duty calling him in another direction. She might see some of her friends passing and join them; but if not, it was all right. Miss Wainwright would see that it was an excellent excuse for them both. "What is that?" said Dr. Copeland from his office. "Were you going to Miss Wainwright's? I shall drive past her place in about 20 minutes. I can drop you there, and call for you on my return. I shall not be later than 9 o'clock." So Mildred and the doctor rode away in comfort, the latter well pleased with his cheery companion; and Holly had trudged away, whistling, to keep back his disappointment. He was fond of Mildred. He had liked the idea of being her escort, and he had liked the idea of meeting Kate Hartzell, who would be sure to be at the prayer meeting. But there was no help for it now. This long walk alone must be taken. His errands were faithfully done, and he was returning from them, whistling still. He had just settled in his mind that it would not be polite to walk down to Miss Wainwright's for Mildred, when his father had promised to call for her, since it was quite too late to think of making attendance at the meeting an excuse for coming. Probably Mildred would rather ride than walk with a little boy like him. He was just passing Jim Moxon's saloon. It was brightly lighted, and behind the closely drawn curtains came sounds of loud voices and coarse laughter. "I think they need to pray," said Holly to himself in indignation. "I wonder if John Hartzell is there? That is the saloon he goes to most. Awful place! I don't know what poor Kate can do. I wish I were a man. I know that I'd find a way to help, seems to me." What was that? The door opened suddenly, a flood of light streamed out on the dark alley. A dark object seemed for a moment to swing in the air, and then land heavily on the sidewalk. At the same instant a heavy boot was drawn within the saloon, and the door was closed again. Holly stopped whistling. Something or somebody had been kicked out and lay there in the gutter. Could it be a man? He came, all trembling with indignation and excitement, and bent over the thing. He touched it, and it moved and groaned slightly. Yes, it was a man. A very dim light from a street lamp on the corner below revealed so much to his earnest gaze. Whoever it was, he had hit his head on the sharp stones of the sidewalk, and blood was trickling down his face. Holly uttered an exclamation of horror. What if the poor fellow should die out there in the ditch? The street was unusually quiet. He was surrounded by saloons. Should he dare to appeal to any of them for help? A wagon rattled by. He knew the whistle of the driver. "Jake!" he shouted. "Hello, Jake! Won't you stop and help me? They have kicked a man out of Moxon's, and he is hurt." "Kicked a man out?" said the teamster in astonishment, stopping his horses and getting down from his wagon. "What did they do that for? He ain't hurt, is he? Only dead drunk. You can't hurt a drunkard much easier than you can a log of wood." "His face is bleeding," said Holly, "and he groaned when I touched him." Then both bent over the prostrate form. Jake, with eyes more accustomed to the darkness, peered steadily for a moment, then raised himself to an upright position and said, "I'm blessed if it ain't old Joe himself, come to this at last. I expected it afore now." "Not old Joe Hartzell? You don't mean him?" There was more than dismay in Holly's voice. It had an undertone of genuine pain. "It's old Joe Hartzell, as sure as you live. I'd know his gray head in a darker night than this." Holly actually groaned. What would Kate do now? Then he thought rapidly. How could he help her? "If it's old Joe," he said eagerly, "let's get him home. I know where he lives. Kate will want him brought home, I am sure. Oh, Jake, you will help me, won't you?" "Why, land," said Jake, "I don't know as we had ought to. He was kicked out, you say. This is a case for the police. He might be hurt bad, you know, and we might get ourselves into a muss. I ought to be home at this minute with the team." But Holly interrupted him with eagerness. "Oh, no, Jake, don't let us have him taken to the lock-up. It isn't so very far to where he lives. I know his sister, and she's a nice girl, a grand, good girl, Jake. She has gone home to live, just to help them, and try to reform her father." "Reform her father!" echoed Jake, with something between a giggle and a sneer. "I'd as soon undertake to reform a brandy flask." "You don't know, Jake. Kate will try, anyhow, and I promised to help, and I know she would want him brought home. You see, she is the kind of girl who would be sure to want it, and father will come down and see him if he is hurt, I know he will. Oh, Jake, do let us lift him into your wagon, without losing any more time. I will pay you. I have 50 cents of my own. I was saving it for Christmas, but I don't care anything about Christmas if we can only get this poor old man safe home." "Sho!" said Jake. "Who said anything about being paid? I didn't. If I'd do it at all, I'd do it for decency's sake quicker than I would for 50 cents, I can tell you. I'd do it for you anyhow, I s'pose, only I don't know about its being the thing to do." But he stooped over the burden, and lifted it with strong arms, unmindful of the groans, or of the fact that other passers-by had stopped curiously. "What's the matter?" one man asked, pushing among the crowd of boys who were gathering. "Oh, Jake," said Holly, in an eager whisper, "don't let him stop you." "I reckon not," said Jake. "Just you step into that there saloon, mister, and find out what is the matter if you can. I'm blessed if we know. Unless they got sick of some of their customers and pitched them out, it looks like it." Whereupon Jake's heavy wagon rattled over the road, and old Joe's unconscious head reposed on Holly Copeland's strong young arm. Arrived at the house on the Flats, all was dark and still, but a wondering neighbor lent the flame of one sickly lamp with which to lighten the scene, and with great effort the old man was lifted to the bed. Nothing more forlorn and poverty-stricken than that poor bed had ever met Holly Copeland's gaze. He did not know what a transformation it had undergone since Kate took possession of the room. He could not conceive of poverty deeper than this which surrounded him now. He looked about him with a sort of fascinated terror, taking it all in at a glance, his face growing almost manly in its sternness. "The idea of such a place as this being Kate Hartzell's home! This means rum," he said, turning to Jake, and giving a significant bend of his head which was meant to cover all the surroundings. "Yes," said Jake, "I reckon it does." He spoke gravely enough, but not with the tone of dismay which marked Holly's speech. He was more used to scenes like these than the boy was. Moreover, he was one of the victims of rum. He had a bottle half filled with brandy in his pocket at this moment, and though he had not the least idea of ever reaching old Joe's state, he could not help remembering that the 2 rooms in which his wife and 3 children waited for him had very few comforts, and the difficulty was rum. "It is mean stuff," he volunteered at last. "I wish there wasn't a drop of it in the world." "You do!" Astonishment on Holly's part. "Aye, that I do. I've always said it. I wish to the land I had never tasted it, and couldn't never taste it again." "And yet you are a man and can vote?" There was an entire temperance lecture in this half sentence. Jake felt it. He had heard of this question before, and he was acquainted with people who talked one way and voted another. But the boy Holly evidently was not. He was young enough still to believe that what people actually wished, they worked for. Jake turned away, a half smile on his face at the "cuteness" of the boy, then gave his attention to the matter at hand. "The question is, what is to be done here? That old fellow will die unless something is done for him, maybe, though I don't believe it. He has too much whiskey aboard. I guess that is about all that ails him." Holly turned in distress. "I don't know what to do next," he said. "If my father knew it, he would come at once. It must be almost time for Kate to come. She would know what to do. I might wait until she came, only there's mother. I'll tell you, Jake, don't you pass our house going home? Would you mind stopping and telling mother I'm all right, and am staying with a sick man a little while? And then leave word for father to come down here as soon as he gets home. That will be the way. You'll do it, won't you, Jake?" "And what will you do? Stay here alone with the old fellow? How will you like that?" "Of course," said Holly, with a lofty toss of his head. "I shan't mind. Kate will be home in a few minutes, I guess." So Jake went away, telling the boy with his last admiring glance that he was a brick. However, Holly was not left long alone. The woman who had lent the lamp was the one whose baby had been laid away so recently. She had tender thoughts of the girl who had come from this house. As soon as she could leave the youngest little girl, she hastened over to see if the old man was really hurt, or "only drunk." That was the way she put it, and Holly, indignant, said, "I should think that that would be enough." The woman stared. "It is more than enough," she said drearily, "but if you lived on the Flats, you would get used to that." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. This recording is in the public domain. Discipline. It was Holly who met the family at the door. Kate was the first to climb the high step. "You are not to be frightened," Holly said, holding the lamp so that she could not see into the room. "Your father has had a fall and is hurt a little. I think not much. I brought him home, and have sent for my father. Do you know whether he has come home yet? He was to call for Mildred Powers. Had he done so when you came away?" "He came just as we started," Kate said. "Oh, Holly!" She went forward and bent over her father. He was lying quietly enough, but the blood which Holly's assistant had vainly tried to stop was still oozing from the wound on his temple, and even in the dim light of that smoking lamp the face was ghastly. "What is it?" said John, coming forward. "What is the matter? How did he get hurt?" "They kicked him out," said Holly, the indignant blood rising to his forehead as he thought of the scene. "I saw it all. They kicked him out of Moxon's saloon. Jake Evans came along just then with his wagon, and we brought him home. They ought to be punished for it." Holly's sentences were mixed, but his listeners knew what he meant. John's face was dark. He was very low down. He had suffered all manner of indignities. He had felt long ago that his self-respect was gone, but to-night he felt that to have an old, gray-haired father kicked from one of the worst saloons in the town was something to remember. There was a sound of feet outside, and a quick knock at the half-closed door. Holly heard his father's voice. "What's to pay here? Is my boy here? Why, Holly, how is this? Kate, good evening. Father hurt? Let me look at him." He pushed rapidly by and reached the bed. There followed a careful examination, and short, decisive directions to one and another of those who looked on. At last the doctor turned from the bed. "It is a very serious affair, Kate. His head has been hurt. It is hard to tell, just now, what the result will be. I suspect we will have a case of fever. The blow is not so serious but he might rally without much trouble if the system were not in such a reduced condition. But as it is—" Here he paused and sighed. No need to remind this girl, with her wide-open, sorrowful eyes, what it was that had so reduced her father's system. A few more directions about the night, a promise to look in, early in the morning, and then the doctor turned to Holly. "Now, my boy, you and I must get home. Your mother is in trouble about you." The boy flushed a little as he moved toward the door. He was not conscious of having done anything that should cause a mother anxiety. Kate came to the door with him, and held the light, and murmured, as he jumped from the high step, "Holly, how you have helped me to-night! You are keeping your promise." He turned and smiled back on her, his face bright. He would help her all he could, he was sure of that. Mrs. Copeland was waiting with anxious face. "What is all this?" she asked, the moment that Holly sprang from the carriage. "What in the world were you doing on the Flats? I did not know you ever went in that part of the town. Here it is nearly 10 o'clock, and I alone, waiting to be interviewed by a wretched teamster, smelling of whiskey, to be told that you are up on the Flats with a drunken man. Holly, what does it mean?" The boy wound an arm caressingly about his mother's neck. "Don't worry, Mother," he said. "I'm all right. I saw a loafer kick an old man out of his saloon door just as I was passing, and Jake Evans came along just then, and I helped him carry the old man home, and waited until Father came. Jake hadn't been drinking to-night, Mother. He was pretty sober. I am real sorry I frightened you, but I did not see anything else to do." "Who was the old man? How did you know what to do or where to go? I cannot understand it. I thought you were a little boy." Holly laughed, glanced at his shadow in the mirror, and drew himself up half an inch. He was growing taller. "I am getting to be a big boy," he said, and he drew a long breath. He wished just then that he were as large as a giant, and had power to sweep the rum traffic out of the world. "Mother, the old man was Kate's father. He is almost 70 years old. Think of kicking him out on the stones! He hurt his head. Father thinks he will be very sick, perhaps will die. If he does, it is murder." His mother uttered an exclamation divided between dismay and disapprobation. "I suppose the poor old wretch had been drinking. It would be almost a blessing to the town if he were to die. What comfort do you suppose such fathers can be to anybody? So that is the way you became mixed up in it. I shall never hear the end of Kate Hartzell, I'm afraid. If she mixes you in with her low associates, I shall never forgive her, Holly." The boy turned eager eyes on his mother. "I will not mix up with rum, Mother. You need not be afraid. I hate it, and so does Kate. It is she who has helped me to hate it. If you could have seen her to-night, you would have understood what she has had to give up for it. I don't wonder that she hates it so. Mother, you never saw such a place to live, and rum made it. I am going to fight rum with all my might. You need not be afraid for me." But she was afraid. She went to bed with a troubled heart. She told the doctor, when he came in, that she would give almost anything if Holly had never seen nor heard of Kate Hartzell. that he was such a queer boy, and Kate had somehow gotten such a hold on him, and now she had gone back among that set, and there was no telling how far Holly might go in his romantic scheme. "She will just be dragged down," said the mother, "and if she gets hold of Holly, I shall never forgive her, nor myself." "Nonsense," said the doctor. "She doesn't look much dragged down yet. And the place is 5 times more decent already than it was. I was there to see the woman some weeks ago, and I can see it has greatly changed for the better already. The boy must see the evil that there is in the world. I would rather he would see the side of rum which shows on the Flats than that which shows up in some of our parlors." "Yes, Dr. Copeland, in the parlor of the Flemings, for instance, where your one daughter is standing beside a young man whose talk is growing thick because he has drank so much home-made wine. But the one in whom she is most interested is not there. He is at this moment in one of the more respectable of the downtown saloons, pouring red-hot brandy down his throat. They will put him to bed by and by, for he is respectable and can pay his bill. In this saloon they do not kick their victims into the street. There are 2 or 3 grades before they graduate them in that manner. To-morrow the respectable young ladies will bow to Eben Bruce, and say to one another that he is fine-looking. And Holly Copeland will suppose him to be a model young man. Better that Holly should get his lessons on rum from old Joe Hartzell than from such as he. If Mrs. Copeland had prophetic eyes, she would bitterly regret the day that her Fanny met this respectable young man who is fascinating her, and would have no regrets to spare for the time spent by Holly on the Flats. Then began work for Kate Hartzell such as she had not planned. Sore work it was, trying alike to nerves and to pride. She had shouldered her heavy cross with vigor, she had so fully taken in the thought of sacrifice and toil and privation and victory that the work she meant to do, the vigilance she meant to use, in order to rescue this brother and this father from the devourer, had actually begun to look almost inviting. She felt herself armed for the conflict. As she walked home from the prayer meeting that Saturday evening, she could give little attention to Lloyd McLean's kind efforts to draw her into conversation, so full was she of the great thoughts and plans born of the hour. In fact, she had roused him instead of his doing that benevolent thing for her. She had, when he unwittingly started her on the right theme, talked so eagerly and well, that, as he bade her good night at the door, he went away saying, "Upon my word, she is a wide-awake girl, and a plucky girl, to go into that den to live, and see what she can do. She ought to succeed. I shouldn't wonder if she would. She ought to have help. I'm half resolved to throw myself into this thing heart and soul, and see what can be done." He had not tarried long enough to see what was waiting for Kate behind that opening door. If he had, it might have given him an added thrill of determination. For a young and able-bodied man it must be something of a stimulus to think of old, trembling limbs and white hairs being kicked into the gutter. For even though the white hairs belong to a drunkard, they are marks of age and the swift coming grave. It is one thing to work early and late, to plan how a room shall be made neat and a supper inviting out of almost nothing; to think out and work out ways of circumventing the enemy; to keep up heart and hope enough for an utterly discouraged and deeply burdened woman to lean upon; to sew, with strong, skillful hand, at honest work, which is to bring honest pay, and help to show the watching world that there is a dignified intention to carry this thing through and support one's self and one's flesh and blood. Kate was ready for all this. It is another thing to sit day after day and night after night beside a worn-out old body, from which the living part seems to have gone away, leaving utter darkness behind; to feed the almost breathless body, at intervals, with sips of food which charity has provided; to give, occasionally, a fresh pillow provided by charity; to shade a lamp, which is decent because charity has seen to it that a decent one came into the room; to watch and wait with folded hands, and yet with hands which must remain there, folded, ready for emergencies; and to feel almost certain that the emergency will be, perhaps, a gasp and a struggle, and then utter and eternal silence. This was Kate Hartzell's work, and for this she was not prepared. She felt like a caged lion. She felt at times as though she must go out and scream. Anything to get away from that bed, made neat by other help than hers. Kept neat, because Miss Wainwright, Mr. Cleveland, and his mother, and 2 or 3 others, were charitable. The very oranges, provided by the thoughtfulness of Mildred Powers, at times so chafed her poor, overwrought nerves, that it seemed to her she must throw them somewhere out of sight. Yet, sit there she must, and watch and wait. Only relieved for a few hours at a time by the sister-in-law, who was too much worn with insufficient food and a broken heart to be worth much as a watcher. As for John, he was at work, and Mr. Cleveland and Lloyd McLean and Miss Hunter and some others about whom Kate did not know so much, were doing her watching for her. So far they were doing it well. John came home each night, sober, grave, ready to sit for a little while by his father and let Kate rest. But even this respite she must not take. "I don't dare to trust him," would Mr. Cleveland say, shaking his head. "He has been working hard, and he is keeping up a fierce struggle during these days, fiercer than you or I can imagine. He needs his long night's quiet sleep, or the battle will go against him." And so, because John Hartzell had chosen to throw away his manhood, it could not be trusted during this strain, and the frail girl must come to the rescue and let him sleep. There were times when Kate curled her lip over it all, and said to herself that a man who had no more manhood than that ought to go down. But this she did not mean. Mrs. John Hartzell's life was certainly passing more quietly, during these days, than it had for years. She kept the small room neat, and cooked as good food as she could, with the necessity upon them of keeping the fire low because of the sick man. She made earnest efforts to have the dishes she prepared for Kate look inviting. But poor Kate was getting where she could not touch them. She utterly loathed the bread of charity. Particularly repugnant to her were the broths, the jellies, and custards that came from Mrs. Copeland's well-stocked home. Mrs. Copeland had relented to the degree that she supposed the poor wretch must have something palatable to eat. So she constantly sent it, but she never came to look in on poor Kate, nor sent her a message. And Kate, worn as she was with watching and excitement, resented this treatment as she had not in the days when it was first offered. Felt insulted, felt that she would rather starve than to eat food of that woman's providing. Indeed, during this hard time, I am not sure but the only warm corner of Kate's heart was kept for the boy Holly. His visits were rare. His mother took care of that. She would not have him going to the Flats under any pretext whatever. And so, save on those rare occasions when the doctor called for his company to hold the horse or to do the errands, Kate saw none of him. Yet hardly a day passed in which she did not get some simple boyish reminder of his sympathy. Often it was an apple, which she could not eat. Sometimes it was a choice confection, which the doctor would produce with an amused smile, and a "Kate, here is something that Holly was sure you would like." Sometimes it was a hurriedly penciled note. "Kate, I don't forget. I am watching for chances to help." One night it was, "Oh, Kate, I know he is very bad. Father says so, but I wouldn't give up hoping. I think he will speak to you again, and maybe tell you some good news. I dreamed last night that he did. Kate, I have been praying for him, and maybe my dream was an answer." Kate cried a little over that letter. She had given up hoping that the living death on the bed would ever use human speech again. She saw doubt grow stronger in the doctor's eyes. It was a terrible strain to the girl to live so constantly in the presence of death, and feel that it was to engulf her father, and that he was not ready for the plunge. Very few realized through what surges of feeling she was passing. Least of all, perhaps, did the girl herself realize it. "I wish you would drink a little of it, Kate. You haven't eaten a thing to-day. How long will you keep up in this way?" It was Mrs. Hartzell who spoke, in a gentle, pleading tone. and the china bowl which she held had an appetizing odor about it. Kate knew the china. It was Mrs. Copeland's. "I can't eat," she said sharply, "and the sooner I break down and am done with all this, the better it will be for me." Then both turned as a shadow darkened the window, and saw Mr. Cleveland. Kate's face was crimson. She was ashamed of her words, yet had seemed to have no power to control them. He took no notice, was as one who had not heard. He had come with a head rest, which the doctor had advised for the sick man, and he helped adjust it with few words, and went his way. But that night, just at dark, Miss Wainwright's carriage drove into the Flats. It was unladen of various things for the comfort of the household. Then both Miss Wainwright and Miss Hunter came into the room. "Child," said the former, nodding her head toward Miss Hunter as she spoke, but looking at Kate, "she has come to stay all night. She is a better nurse than you are, and you are to go home with me and go to bed." To Kate's eager protest she returned no other answer than to say to Mrs. John Hartzell, "Where is her bonnet? Put it on her," which Mrs. Hartzell did. An hour later poor, tired Kate sat among the cushions of a luxurious chair, and sipped creamy milk, and ate crumbs of biscuit. Mr. Cleveland sat at a table in the corner. He had been looking over and arranging certain business papers for Miss Wainwright. As he now arose and handed them to that lady, he said, "These are the ones you need to sign. Do it now, please, and I will take them with me." While he waited, he said to Kate, speaking low, "I am keeping my contract with you, but you are not satisfied with God's way of doing it, are you? You want your own." Then he went away. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Storm and calm. A fierce November wind was blowing, which made the gentlemen who were hurrying through the streets of Chicago button their overcoats about them. "Cold enough for January," said one and another, bowing hurriedly as they passed, though what they meant by that expression is doubtful, as everybody knows that it can be as cold in Chicago in November as January. But the wind was certainly piercing. Altogether, it was not such a night as would be likely to find one loitering on the street in contemplative mood over water which rolled sluggishly below, impeded by gathering films of ice. So when Mr. Durant, hurrying home from detentions, after a late meeting, saw a young man thus standing, looking down into the black water, the very attitude arrested his attention. A street lamp was near at hand, and though the man, intent on whatever held his eyes, did not turn as Mr. Durant drew near, the light fell on his side face in such a way as to give a fair view, and the expression of it was startling to a man who had spent some years in the earnest study of faces, with a view to helping their owners in emergencies. At first he passed, then hesitated, looked back, and finally retraced his steps, and laid a firm, kind hand on the stranger's shoulder. "Young man, that is rather a dark prospect on such a night as this. What do you find in it that interests you so?" "That is my business," muttered the man, and he tried to shake off the firm hand. His voice was low, but had a cadence of sullenness in it, such as is born generally both of despair and resolve. "It is my business, too," said Mr. Durant, speaking with cheerful promptness. "I was sent to ask you what was the trouble, and how I could help you." The man seemed to be arrested by this word, despite a determination not to be. He turned and gave Mr. Durant the benefit of a full view of his fierce, dark face. "Who sent you?" he asked. The answer was given unhesitatingly. "A friend of yours, who is more interested in you than you have any idea of. He will be glad to help you in any way that you need help, and I am glad to be his messenger. Now, what can I do for you? I see you are in trouble." Part of the trouble he suspected, and had, of course, suspected from the first. The man had been drinking. Face and breath indicated this. But he was not exactly intoxicated, and there was more in his face than the passing whim of a drunken man. Mr. Durant, who had been perilously near to such places, could have given unhesitating testimony to the belief that the dark water held the stranger's gaze, because it said to him that one plunge in the night and the darkness, and all this certainty of trouble would be over. There is a certain form of cowardice well known to drinking men, which shrinks only from the known, and is willing to plunge desperately and hopelessly into the darkness of the future world, to get rid of the miseries of to-day. "Come," he said, giving a gentle pressure to the arm on which his hand rested. "Let us walk along out of this wind. It sweeps around the corner fiercely. You can tell me as we go what it is you need." "You cannot help me," the man said. "There is no help for me in this world." Nevertheless, he turned and walked with the unknown friend, impelled, apparently, by the stronger will against his judgment, or at least his inclination. "That is a mistake," was the cheery answer. "I told you you had a friend who was willing to help you, no matter what the circumstances. I have also to tell you that he has the power to help. But you must confide in him, you know." It was a strange walk. Mr. Durant, who had taken many strange ones during the latter years of his life, felt that none would exceed this. He seemed to have a certain degree of power over this young man, enough to move him forward at least; and he, on his part, seemed impelled by a force outside of himself to go with this man and watch him, and shield him from something, or someone, himself probably; since himself, in this mood at least, could be his worst enemy. But he had no idea where to take him, nor what to do next. If the man would only make some explanation of the fierce resolve in his face. "I wish you would let me alone," the stranger said at last, stopping in the street, trying to draw away his arm, making an effort to turn back. "What business have you to take hold of me in this way and lead me along? I had about decided it when you interfered." "I know you had, and it is the worst decision you ever made in your life; and you know you have made a great many. I came just in time to save you. I was sent, I tell you, and you won't confide in a friend who is willing and able to help you out." Two fashionably dressed young men were nearing them, walking with unsteady steps, and talking loud, their voices thick and their laughter silly and meaningless. Victims they were to the general curse. They were dressed as though they might very recently have come from some fashionable gathering, and the probabilities were strong that they had but lately left the petted darling of some sheltered home to indulge outside tastes which had been roused anew in some fashionable social gathering. "Halloo!" said one, speaking thickly. "Here's Airedale! What's up, old fellow? Look as though you had met a ghost, and it had you by the buttonhole." Then they passed, the air filled with their vapid laughter. But Mr. Durant almost stopped in the street. He felt a shock like that of an electric battery in his veins. Airedale, that uncommon name! The one he had especially laid away in his memory. 3 days he had been in Chicago, and 3 hours at least he had given to hunting for a young man who bore that name, unable, so far, to get any clue to his whereabouts. He had left the firm which had originally employed him, and gone, no one in that establishment seemed to know whither. Was this the object of his search? If so, he could well account for the impelling power which said, "Hold this man, don't let him escape your sympathy and your help." For since the name was written in his note-book, it had been added to his prayer, until he began to feel within him an intense desire to find the man, and to help him, if he needed help. This young man, whom he was drawing on by sheer force of will, was certainly in need of help, was certainly in great and imminent danger, from himself if from no one else. Could he be the Airedale of his prayers? What did the Lord want him to do here and now, if this were so? He hesitated, he shrank from it. It seemed a breach of trust, and yet it forced itself upon him as the thing to do. In some way he must win this man's confidence. "Airedale," he said, repeating the name as though he had not a doubt of the person to whom it belonged, "you think I am a stranger, that I do not know anything about you. You are mistaken. I know 2 or 3 things about you, beside the fact that you are just now sorely in need of a friend. I will tell you of some one else whom I know, and then you may decide to what extent you can trust me. I know Mildred Powers." He could feel the start, and the tremor which ran through the man's frame, yet he replied quickly and fiercely, "I don't want to hear anything about her." "I don't wonder at that, my friend. You are disgracing her friendship, and you know it. Still, there is a chance to retrieve the past, and live so that you will not be ashamed to hear the name of a good woman mentioned." "No, there isn't. You don't know what you are talking about. I've gone beyond the chance." "No, you haven't. I know just what I am talking about, and I know you are talking nonsense. I tell you there is a chance to win the respect of all who now despise you. I am not talking in the dark. I don't care what your past is. I bring you offers of help powerful enough to blot out the past." The poor, confused brain of the only half-sober man was impressed in spite apparently of his effort to struggle against the impression. During this time they had been walking somewhat rapidly. The fierceness of the wind naturally hastened the steps of all walkers that evening, and Mr. Durant's force of character hastened the steps of his faltering companion. They were nearing the former's boarding-house. "Come up into my room," Mr. Durant said, as he caught sight of the familiar corner. "I want to talk with you, to tell you something, just as soon as you are able to hear it. You need not be afraid. I will see that you are shielded from observation if you choose. I assure you that you may trust me." For the man was holding back, trying to withdraw his arm. "It is too cold to walk in the streets, and I have something of importance to say to you. Come, your teeth are chattering now, as if you had an ague fit. You are chilled through. My room is warm, and there is nobody in it. I have a pass key." And with one firm hand still on the arm of the half-crazed young man, he contrived to unlock the door, and draw his companion within the hall, apparently more by force of will than by physical effort, though in going upstairs the latter was needed. The man leaned heavily against his guide, and groaned as if in pain. By the time his own door was reached, and he was with nervous haste applying the key, Mr. Durant felt by the dead weight against him, and the heavy breathing, that something more than nervous terror or the exhaustion of liquor was upon his companion. Indeed, by the time he had succeeded in dragging the poor fellow to the bed, and placing pillows under his head, he saw that he was utterly unconscious, not from the stupor of liquor, but from some more immediately alarming cause. He rang the bell sharply, and sent for a physician, and ordered restoratives of one sort and another, and worked bravely and well for the life of the man thus strangely thrown into his care. And this was the very night in which Kate Hartzell had drank her glass of milk, and nibbled her biscuit from Miss Wainwright's hand, and taken her strong tonic at the hands of Mr. Cleveland, and cried. I presume the milk, and the biscuits, and the night of unbroken rest, helped Kate Hartzell back to common sense. Certainly the tonic did. The sun shone when she awoke next morning. The air was clear and cold. Kate opened her window wide, and took in the crisp, frosty air, and felt that her pulses were steadier than they had been in some time, and her eyes wider open. She began to understand something of the meaning of her few past days of experience. She was a rebel, that much was plain, and she had not imagined it before. It had seemed to her so strange, so unaccountable, so cruel, that on the very evening when she had first thrilled with the desire and the determination to save her father, he should have been thrown beyond her grasp. Why could not God have shielded him from that blow? Why could he not have given her a chance to try? She had been wicked not to try before, she knew that, and she asked to be forgiven. But was it like God to take away her opportunity the moment he had opened her eyes to the fact that there was an opportunity? Was not this very flash of hope for her poor father a heaven-sent thought in answer to her prayer? She had supposed so, and Mr. Cleveland had seemed to suppose so, when she spoke to him. Was it possible that God meant only a thrust, in the shape of that terrible "it might have been"? She did not, and could not, understand it. You are not to understand that all these thoughts had taken clear and logical shape in Kate Hartzell's brain. They had simply hovered around her during those nights of hopeless waiting and watching. She would have been shocked had she realized half their import. She was shocked this morning when she saw them in the full light of the tonic which had hurt so the night before. She was certainly a rebel against the ways of God. What else could these thoughts mean? Shall not the Judge of all the earth do right? Had she really presumed to dictate to God the way in which he should answer her prayer for her father? But could this be an answer? Here was her father apparently going down to the grave in darkness and silence, going as he had lived, no chance to right the fearful wrongs of his life. And she, God's child, had begged and prayed him, now that he had opened her eyes to her duty, to give her chances to work. Well, what of it all? Suppose God saw that the only way to reach Joel Hartzell was to place him in unconsciousness on this bed of pain. But could he be reached in this way? She did not know. Did not God? If there were any way for God to reach Joel Hartzell, since he had given Jesus up to death for Joel Hartzell's sake, would he not reach him? And if Joel Hartzell, in his blindness, would not be reached, should she blame God? She had cried at first over the sharpness of the tonic, which seemed to rasp into her very soul. Then she had been startled and frightened over the power of the truth which it revealed to her. No, she had not trusted God. On the contrary, she had felt herself and her father cruelly treated by him. She crept out of her bed to her knees somewhere toward midnight, when the strength of this humiliation came to her, and cried to her Father in heaven, not to spare the earthly father, but to forgive the rebel child, which had presumed to be wiser than Father and Saviour. After that she had slept, a long, sound, healthful sleep, and this morning she had awakened calm and brave. "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." She did not think of the verse, but something of its spirit was in her thoughts. Yes, though Joe Hartzell never spoke a word on earth again, as seemed altogether probable, she would understand that God had done for him all that an infinite God could do. She would understand that her father had chosen his portion, and held to his choice, even in defiance of God. You wonder how she could be calm under such a thought. I can tell you that it rested her. It is a fearful thing for one who loves the Lord to move about under the Satan-inflicted torture of the thought, "He is cruel, he is cruel." Kate Hartzell had been under that torture for days. When it lifted, and she could say, "He has done right, he will do right, whatever comes," it rested her, made her strong for service. She came downstairs with the assured step of one ready for the day. "Thank you," she said to Miss Wainwright in the hall, and smiled as she spoke. "I did not know that one night could do so much for anybody. I am ready now for work." "She really looks rested," Miss Wainwright said. It was half an hour afterward, and she was speaking to Mr. Cleveland. He had called in his carriage with the morning mail, and offered to take both Kate and Miss Wainwright to the Flats if they wished. "Miss Hartzell," he said, as he was helping her from the carriage, "Holly told me to tell you that he asked his father this morning whether, in cases like your father's, they were always as unconscious as they seemed; whether it might not be possible that your father knew something of what went on about him at times, and the doctor replied it was quite possible. Holly seemed to think it might comfort you to know this." "It does," said Kate. "Thank you." And when he held open the door for her to pass, she said again, "Mr. Cleveland, thank you." This time she did not mean for the information from Holly, nor yet for the ride home, but she left him to think what he would, and passed on, with Miss Wainwright, into the room, and to her father's bedside. A watcher, with a new lease of strength and patience. Chapter 23 of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Shadowed Lives. In one of the beautiful homes, which are so numerous on Pennsylvania Avenue, seated at an upper front window, looking out upon the passers-by, with that far-away air which says, "I see them and do not see them, they are all as less than nothing to me, and I care not what becomes of any of them," was Mildred Powers. All about her were lavish evidences of wealth and refined taste. Nothing, certainly, that money could buy had been spared to make this room of hers a place in which she might delight to stay. But the face which looked out from the bay window, where birds and flowers were enjoying the brightness of the day, was far from bright. There were traces of tears, and there were marks of a sorrow which tears could not relieve. It was a young face to be so shadowed. As you looked at it, you could not help hoping that time would efface the traces of sorrow. But certainly they are there now. She was quiet enough. The first storm of her grief had calmed. In her lap lay pages of paper closely written. Something in the way in which her hand grasped the papers would have led you to conclude that they had to do with her trouble, whatever it was. That she had not just now given them a first reading was also evident. They were held as papers with which she was, and had been for some time, perfectly familiar, but which were, nevertheless, of grave importance. Meantime, her mind was busy with a problem which she shrank from settling. This letter had been in her possession for 3 days, and she was still revolving the question whether it was her duty to take it down to her mother. "Of course, mamma must know," she said to herself mournfully. "But ought I to give her the entire story in detail? Would it be wrong, I wonder, to tell her about it as fully as she chooses to question, and let the rest pass?" Unquestionably this would be the easier way. There were sentences on those pages which she shrank from having any eye read, even a mother's. Still, ought she, a young girl, to have in her possession a letter, one line of which she was not willing to have her mother read? "Mamma will trust me," she said aloud, and half indignantly, as if in reply to some suggestion from outside. But all the more did it immediately occur to her that she would be worthy of the trust. The end of the mental discussion was, that Mildred gathered the papers into their envelope, and went across the hall to her mother's room. A beautiful room, furnished with the same disregard of expense which had characterized Mildred's, and with the same exquisite regard to taste; though the colors were more subdued, and the appointments of the toilet were for quiet, middle life, rather than for girlish tastes. The lady who sat by the open grate fire, with a light shawl thrown gracefully about her, and writing materials at her side, was an older edition of Mildred herself. Eyes and lips, and features generally, were repeated. Once you could have said the same of the hair, but Mildred's was a rich brown, while the still young mother's was plentifully streaked with gray. "Sudden and heavy sorrow brings gray hairs fast." Mildred had heard her mother say this with a sigh. She thought of it that morning when she was brushing out her long, brown locks. Would the gray hairs come fast among them now? Her sorrow was heavy, so she thought, poor child, and it had been sudden enough. She had not dreamed of anything like this until the letter came. The elder lady looked up on Mildred's entrance. "Well, daughter," she said with a smile, and made room for her on the couch near at hand, brushing away the accumulation of papers and a book or two. "Mamma," said Mildred, talking rapidly and not heeding the movement, "I had a letter come the other day." "So Maria told me." The voice was quiet, the eyes still smiling. "I have been biding my time. I knew you would want to show it to mother after a while, for I saw that it troubled you." "Mamma," with a little catch in her breath that told of strong and suppressed emotion, "I did not know how to show it to you, but I thought I ought. In the first place, you will not understand, it is from a gentleman, a stranger." Mrs. Powers removed her foot from the hassock and sat erect, drawing her shawl about her with almost a shiver, and, as Mildred again paused, said, "Well, daughter," her voice tender but alert. What new danger was this? The world was full of wolves, and she had but one very choice lamb. "Mamma, you need not be afraid, not in that way. It isn't anything foolish. He is a gentleman whom I met while I was with Fanny Copeland. I don't know him much, only he is a Christian gentleman, a temperance worker. He seeks out young men who need help and tries to help them. I had an opportunity to speak to him alone for a moment. I knew he was going to Chicago, and I gave him Leonard Airedale's address and said that I thought perhaps he needed help. I did not ask him to write to me, mamma, of course not. I did not give him permission to mention my name to Mr. Airedale. I just spoke to him as you might speak to a good man, of one whom you thought he might be able to help. I did in all respects as I thought you would like your daughter to do." "I know, daughter, I trust you fully. And now this gentleman has written you about him, pleading for him, I suppose, and you are a little afraid to have mother see the letter. But, daughter, it is surely right that I should do so. Thank you for coming to me." And she held out her hand. Mildred dropped the letter into it without another word, and, passing, went over to the window, where she looked blindly down on the people below. "There stands Mildred Powers, framed in just the right light to make a pretty picture of herself," said one of the passers-by, glancing up as she spoke. "All the prettier because she is utterly unconscious of it. If that girl isn't a favorite of fortune, I don't know who is. Wealth and leisure and beauty and friends, nothing to trouble her, nothing to worry about in any way, and a general favorite with all the people worth knowing." "Yet she has buried her father." "I know," and the speaker's tones grew gentler, "but he was a grand man, ready to die; and time, you know, has softened that sorrow. Her father is simply a beautiful memory to her, which it helps her to recall; and her mother is young and well and devoted to Mildred. It is difficult to see how the troubles of life, which they say come to all people, are going to get a chance to touch her." And the speaker sighed as though she had felt the touch of trouble in no gentle form. Yet at this moment the sheltered girl of whom they spoke carried the sorest heart which she thought it possible for any one to have, and looked at the speakers with eyes that were blinded by a rush of bitter tears. Mrs. Powers pushed writing desk and papers from her, and grasped at that letter with a long-drawn sigh of suppressed disappointment. The one anxiety of her life was pressing up again, and had brought with it perhaps a strong ally, and she must combat her daughter's wishes all alone. If her father were only here! The widow did not speak those words aloud; she only sighed them into the ears of the infinite and pitying God. Then she began to read. "My dear Miss Powers, you did not give me permission to write to you, yet I have that to say which is just what you should hear. In the first place, I have to ask your forgiveness, and your mother's. I have exceeded the bounds of the commission given me. I found the young man of whom you told me, and found, as you surmised, that he needed a friend; and, in order to give myself a chance of befriending him, I was obliged to say that I was a friend, or at least an acquaintance, of yours. Now to my story. I was hurrying to my boarding place on the third evening after my arrival in Chicago. I had spent some hours in search of the person whose name you gave me, without avail. He had left the employment of the firm mentioned, and I could get no clue. On this evening, as I was hastening up town, I saw a young man standing, studying the water below him, in a way that boded no good. At first I passed, then felt impelled to turn and speak. I received an unsatisfactory answer, but for some reason I could not bring myself to leave the man. I tried to draw him into conversation, to win his confidence. The more I tried, the more sure I felt that he was in peril, and needed help. Two young men passed by, both partially intoxicated, and spoke to the stranger, calling him by name. I recognized the name as the one you had given me. It was then and there that I exceeded my instructions, and tried to rouse the man by speaking your name, and claiming myself as a friend of yours and his. I think it was because of this that I succeeded in getting him to go home with me. It was well I did. I hope and trust we may, by this means, have saved a soul. He was at that time under the influence of liquor. I just succeeded in getting him inside my own door, when he fell against me heavily, not in a drunken stupor, but with something more serious. It proved to be a sort of fit. The brain was seriously congested, and the physician whom we promptly summoned gave it as his opinion that the poor fellow would not live till morning. I hasten over the days which followed to tell you that he is now living, and on the road, we trust, to mental and physical recovery. He has had a very alarming illness, and still lies in a weak state. This is only part, and perhaps for his friends not the hardest part of the story. I have been with him much during his illness, spending the greater portion of my nights in his room, as in the fever of delirium he clung to me. I have learned to know a great deal about his past, and it is a sad record. Of late he has been going down very rapidly. He fell in with a hard class of young men, but truth compels me to state that he was their leader rather than their follower. He went astray in almost every way that you can imagine. In many ways that I rejoice to believe you cannot imagine. He was discharged by the employers whose address I had because of dissipation. On the evening in which I found him, he was not so much intoxicated as to be unaware of what he was doing. He had, as I feared, planned self-destruction. I thought I saw that in his face as I passed. He was in deep trouble, which came clear to us during the time that he lay in delirium. He had become involved in pecuniary trouble, had gambled, as sooner or later nearly all drinkers do, and in a fit of drunken despair had forged the firm name of his former employers, for not a very large amount, but quite large enough to send him to the State's prison. The matter was not sharply managed, and came to light before he had a chance to get out of the country. It was the belief that he was being shadowed by the police which had determined him to make, what he called, an end of the whole miserable business. His idea of the end was to drown himself. When the facts of the case came to light, some of the Christian men in the city took hold of the matter, visited his employers, secured a stay of proceedings, and eventually secured a compromise. His mother was telegraphed for, and came on at once, exerting herself earnestly in his behalf. We were enabled, as soon as the delirium passed, to give the poor man the news that he would not be arrested for forgery, that the matter was settled and the sinner forgiven. He appeared grateful, and shed some tears. But I must own to you, what in your sheltered life you probably do not realize, that sin has a way of blunting the sensibilities. He was neither so grateful nor so penitent as you might have supposed. I do not think he was deeply overwhelmed with the sin of what he had done, but simply with the thought of consequences, and, these being averted, he was ready to take hold of life again. I urged him to sign a pledge to let his worst enemy alone forever, but he assured me that he could do that without signing any pledge, that he had drank his last drop. I hope this is so, but I have little faith in it. Perhaps the poor fellow must drink deeper of the dregs of sin before he will consent to be saved. And now, my friend, there is another and a very dark side to this sad picture of a perverted life. There came, repeatedly, during the earlier days of his illness and unconsciousness, a poor, sorrowful-looking young woman, quite young, only a child, she would have been called in a sheltered home, with a loving mother to watch over her. But she has neither a mother nor father. She did not, however, look like a sinful woman. She expressed the most intense anxiety for the sick and, as we thought, dying man. Day after day she came and begged to see him. When we told her that he was entirely unconscious, and would probably remain so, she broke into a perfect passion of tears, and begged to sit beside him for only a little while. At last I asked her, as gently as I could, what reason she, a young girl, had for expecting to be admitted to the room of a young man who was no kin to her. I assured her that he had the best of care, the most skilful of physicians. There was nothing she could do for him. How could she expect to be admitted, and why did she wish it? The poor thing lost every vestige, then, of her attempted self-control, and assured me, with bitter sobs, that she was the young man's wife. Of course I was shocked and dismayed. But when I questioned and cross-questioned, she told a straightforward story. It was a secret, she declared, and she was not to reveal it. She would not have done so for anything in the world, only, if the man was going to die, she must and would see him once more. I took her to his mother. She undertook to prove the falseness of the young woman's story, assuring me that it was not possible. Earnest investigation on her part and on mine established beyond a shadow of doubt the truth of the poor girl's statement. The young man was intoxicated at the time. He had not realized in any sense the step he was taking. Nevertheless, he took it. They went to the house of a clergyman in the suburbs, and whether the reverend gentleman was so accustomed to the fumes of liquor about young men as to take no notice, or whether he thought the matter was not of his concern, I do not yet understand. However it was, he performed the ceremony which made them husband and wife. That was 2 months ago last Friday night, since which time the girl has seen but little of him, and it was his deliberate intention to desert her and make his escape to some foreign port, where he told me he had meant to turn over a new leaf and live as he ought. No sense of the solemnity of the vows which he had taken seemed to impress him. On the contrary, he appeared to be overwhelmed with astonishment that even his mother should tell him it was his duty to recognize the young woman as his lawful wife. "But I did not mean to marry her," he said. "I was drunk when I did it." My dear Miss Powers, I have thought it my duty to tell you this long, sad story plainly; for, however painful it may be to his friends, it is necessary that they should know the truth. His steps have been downward for the past year to an alarming extent. I am to remain in Chicago some 2 or 3 weeks yet. If your mother desires me to serve her in any way in this connection, I shall be glad to do so. Of course you will communicate with her, and if I hear from her I shall make it my first effort to execute her will. If there is nothing further to be done, of course I expect no reply to this. Mrs. Airedale is now with her husband, caring for him as a wife can. She is young and ignorant, but loving and good intentioned, and deceived. She has gone as no daughter could go who had a true mother, and she has a sad harvest to reap, I fear. I am at work for my Master, and recognize you as one of the laborers. Therefore I make no apology for burdening you with the details of this account. I kept my pledge, and shall continue the name on my list for work and prayer. Yours in Christian bonds, Scott Durant. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Touch of the World. Beyond a dismayed exclamation at first, when she read of her daughter's name as being spoken in the midnight streets of Chicago, Mrs. Powers, with a glance toward the figure by the window, read in rapid silence through the closely written sheets. To describe the various sensations which thrilled her as she read would be a difficult thing. Surprise, dismay, disapproval, indignation, relief, all these blended. Yet I hope you will not misjudge her when I tell you that relief was the strongest feeling, that she dropped the last sheet, and with clasped hands murmured, "Thank God!" Not aloud. She would not have had the girl by the window hear her for the world. She understood the human heart well enough to know that the girl could neither say it nor sympathize with it. Not yet. She went swiftly over the story, gathering it into a few seconds of time, as the mind can do. Mildred, her one sheltered and treasured blossom, sent out from her for the first time to the perils of boarding-school life; sent out, guarded and shielded on every side; trusted, as the mother exultingly felt few mothers could trust their daughters. She had proved worthy of that trust. The mother distinctly remembered that first letter of petition. "Mamma, they want me to write for your permission to dance with them at the Friday socials. Madame Farrar says you need have no fears of my meeting any whom you would not invite to your own parlors. She is very particular. They have only the square dances. Madame Farrar does not approve of any others, of course; and only 1 or 2 sets are allowed in an evening. She says to dance for hours is as silly as it is to eat for hours. I don't care much about it, mamma, only of course it is a little embarrassing to be quite alone. I am the only one here who does not dance; but then, of course, dear mamma, that is of no consequence at all, if you would rather not." The mother remembered the sweet wording of the letter; what satisfaction it had been to her heart to feel that all these expressions were true. She remembered just how she had studied over the question; taken counsel over it. She could see now the tap of her pastor's kid glove against his one gloved hand, as he expressed his opinion. "We must not draw the reins too closely, my dear Mrs. Powers, else there may be danger of a rebound. Not that you have occasion to fear that, of course, in Mildred's case," he had hastened to add, because she remembered she had drawn herself up, and assured him that she had no fear of her daughter; that her happiness really was not dependent on such trivialities. "But then," he had added, "I really think harm is often done in these ways. The fact is, young people will be young people, and it is right that they should be; and I should say that Madame Farrar's judgment was to be depended upon. I do not believe in indiscriminate dancing, of course; yet, properly managed, it is a graceful and healthful amusement. We must not separate ourselves too entirely from the well intentioned, well behaved world, you know, lest we lose all influence over it." After her pastor left her, Mrs. Powers remembered that she felt in doubt as to whether he had given her any advice, after all. He seemed to have uttered a few commonplaces with which she was quite familiar. Still, he had influenced her. She felt, after talking with him, less inclined to hold Mildred aloof from the amusements which seemed to belong to youth. Not satisfied, but inclined to yield. For the 100th time since her widowhood, she said with a deep sigh, "If I only knew what her father would say." What had he said when alive? Why, nothing tangible, or sufficiently definite for her to fall back upon now. He had shaken his head over many gatherings to which Mildred had been invited. "I don't like it," he had said. "She is but a child; she is better off with her mother; make her happy without these things." And the mother had done so, and held her child to the society of her parents and their choice friends, and made her happy with them. And questions which perhaps ought to have been definitely settled were simply pushed into the vague future. Now the father was gone, and Mildred was no longer a child, and was away from home, and mingling with others of her age exclusively. Must she not do in a degree as they did, or be uncomfortable? The conclusion was that the mother wrote her darling: "You know, daughter, that mother does not approve of much dancing; and the round dances, I think, are positively degrading. I know you will never be tempted by them. I suppose the sort of dancing which Madame Farrar admits is hardly more than a promenade in which one keeps step to music. I will leave the matter to your judgment, daughter. I am so glad to remember that I have a daughter to trust." And Mildred had written her joyous letters after that about the Friday socials. It was pleasanter to join the dancers than it had been to stand in a corner and look on. They had delightful talks, too, while dancing. She was introduced last evening to a friend of Madame Farrar's son. He came occasionally to the socials. He asked an introduction to her because she was such a graceful dancer. "Think of that, mamma," the happy girl had written, "when I never went to dancing school in my life! I told him so, and he said it was natural for flowers to have sweet odors, and for birds to sing. I might have told him of many a flower which has no odor, and that there are nice little gray birds who do not sing at all; but I didn't. However, I did tell him that I hoped my friends would have a better reason for choosing me than that I was a good dancer. He is very pleasant, mamma, but a little too fond of dancing for me to admire him much. His name is Airedale, Leonard Airedale. Euphonious, isn't it?" After that the euphonious name had crept into almost every letter. Curiously, too, it was nearly always connected with dancing. "Mr. Airedale and she led the set." "Mr. Airedale and she danced both sets together, and begged Madame Farrar for a third, but she would not grant it." And then had come a sentence which Mrs. Powers did not like. "Mamma, I begin to understand what a fascination this amusement can become to some people. There is something very delightful in rhythmical movements, with the room full of sweet sound, and bright with flowers, and rich with perfume. I am always sorry when the hour is over. Still, I think it makes a great difference with whom one dances. Mamma, do you mind that I always dance with Mr. Airedale, and with no one else? I don't enjoy it with others, and he doesn't. He is a very fine dancer. Mamma, he says that some of the round dances are not objectionable, and that he is sure I would enjoy them very much." With wide open, nervous eyes had the mother read this letter. Who and what was Mr. Airedale? Why had she not taken alarm before? She had thought of him as one of the boys, and considered him as good as any for her daughter to walk around with in the musical promenade. She wrote some earnest words of warning and advice. Alas, too late! Not too late for obedience, but for peace. The fair daughter, who had gone away a child, confessed that in this dancer she had found a friend. She liked to be with him, liked to hear his talk, liked everything about him, would be willing to dance round dances or no dances at all at his bidding. He was not a boy. He was 7 years older than she, and a business man, a confidential clerk in a Chicago house. He was here on some business for the firm, and tarrying longer than he had meant. On her account, he confessed. Then did Mrs. Powers make a hasty journey to the renowned school where she had sheltered her daughter from the dangers of this wicked world. She saw and heard the handsome young man whom her daughter's dancing had won. The wise mother did not feel fascinated by him as the daughter had done. She did not trust him. Close inquiry brought to light the fact that his habits were none of the best, that he sometimes left the school socials at the discreet hour of 10, and spent the time until long after midnight in some fashionable saloon. No breath of this had Mildred known. The startled Madame Farrar confessed that she had not such an idea, that her son considered the young man unexceptionable, else he would not have been invited to the socials. And the troubled mother did not like to tell her that there were people who did not consider the son himself unexceptionable. She told her sad discoveries to Mildred, who in turn told them frankly to Leonard Airedale. Alas for the watchful mother! She had let a stranger creep into her place in her daughter's heart. Leonard Airedale was partly penitent and partly indignant. A little of the story was true, and a great deal of it was false. He had been tempted 2 or 3 times to drink more wine than was good for him. He admitted that he was sorely tempted in this way. But he pleaded and promised, if she would be his friend, would stand by him and believe in him, he would reform his life in every possible way, so that the very angels could not find a flaw. She had it in her power to mold him at her will. He had discovered that life would be a desert without her, and a Garden of Eden in her presence. You have heard all that sort of thing. It may be you are old enough to smile over it, and wise enough to take it for what it is worth. But Mildred was young and ignorant, and had been away from her mother, and had been caught unawares in the meshes of this fascinating world. Still she was a true, pure girl, in that she came directly to that mother with the story and the plea. She believed in Leonard Airedale. She believed that she held his interests in her power. She was more than ready to sacrifice herself. Not so her mother. She had heard before about "molding tempted lives." She believed in one who could do it, and that one neither her daughter nor her daughter's friend had sought. There was more to reform, she believed, than the young man had admitted. Had he been entirely frank with mother and daughter, it would actually have been better for his interests. As it was, the mother was as firm as adamant. The young man might reform; she would be glad if he would; but it must not be because her daughter held out hopes to him which she earnestly hoped would never be realized. The first step toward right doing would be to return to the business in Chicago which he had so long neglected. Let him go to his work and prove himself a man if he would, but not a letter or a line must pass between the two for at least a year. She would have no break in the silence. She would not allow a message, through a third party, from the one to the other. A year was a very short time to the mother. I suppose it was an eternity to Mildred, poor thing. Leonard Airedale thought the mother hard and cruel. He did not dare say so in words to her loyal daughter, almost a pity that he did not, but he hovered about the idea until it left its impress. Mildred would not have owned to another that her mother could do other than right, but she told herself that "Mamma had forgotten that she was once young." Mr. Airedale went away, and the mother went back home, and life went on. The next thing that poor Mildred did was to grow more gay and frivolous than she had ever been, to mingle in all that was of the world with a zest that she had not shown before. She was trying, poor creature, to find happiness in the ways which had lately seemed so pleasant to her. It was about this time that her intimacy with Fanny Copeland deepened. Fanny admired and missed the handsome Chicago gentleman, and openly lamented the loss to their circle in his absence. Mildred liked her for appreciating him, and drew nearer to her; and the mother, at home, cried over the changed tone in her darling's letters, and listened to her pastor on the Sabbath with a sore heart, as he delivered his eloquent sentences. If only he had cautioned her to make every effort to keep her darling unspotted from the world, the issue might have been different. Yet I am glad to tell you that this Christian mother did not lay all the blame on her pastor, nor on her other worldly wise friends. She remembered that she had an unerring guide, and had she lived close enough to him to hear his voice reminding her to walk apart, as one who belonged to a peculiar people, she could have held her daughter away from much that had injured. Well, the days passed, and one day while the mother was praying, there came to Mildred an experience such as she had known nothing about before. It was just a week or two before the close of the summer term, and she was sad at the thought of going away from associations which were fraught with tender memories. She wandered about a great deal, taking last walks and deepening old associations. She wandered one afternoon into the church, whither she had once gone with Leonard Airedale. It was a week day, but the church was open and the organ was playing. She remembered the seat in which they two had sat, she and Leonard. She would slip in and take the same seat again if she could. It might be a marriage ceremony, or it might be a funeral, she did not care. There was no doorkeeper; it was an open service. So she slipped in. It was a Bible meeting. She had never been to such an one before. She had declined, but the evening before, an invitation to attend this. How did it come about that the words spoken there should be just the ones suited to reach the heart of this young, troubled soul who thought her burden heavy? God knows. There was a mother at home praying for her one charge. We shall probably never know, on this side, how far the prayers of the mothers at home reach. The troubled soul of Mildred Powers found rest that day. When she came out of the church, an hour afterward, she did not understand it. She knew that the weight of pain was gone, but she supposed it would return again. She knew that she had felt a sudden conviction that the Saviour who made the human heart was the one on whom to depend now. She knew that she resolved then and there to turn to him and follow his leading, but she did not understand what a tremendous difference this would make in all her after life. The weight never returned, not as it had rested before. Not even on this sad afternoon, when she stood and looked out blindly at nothing. She knew even then that there was an undertone of melody in her heart, the refrain of which was, "He knows, he will not let this crush me. He cares." The mother had understood it better. She had shed tears of joy when the sweet letter came which told of her daughter's new friend. The mother had walked alone in her Christian life ever since the father went away. She had drawn nearer to Christ during these years of loneliness, and by so much more had she longed for and waited for her daughter. It seemed wonderful to her that, born of this trouble which had shadowed her like a pall, had been this great new joy. She began to have a dim notion of the meaning of the "all things working together." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Pledges. Still there had been anxiety during all these months. The school term closed, and the daughter came home, sweet, cheerful, dutiful as ever, yet changed. She never spoke of Leonard Airedale, but that she thought of him the mother was almost sure. She was interested in many of her old pursuits, but in a quieter way than ever before. She cared almost nothing for the gay world around her. She held herself aloof from society when she could. She danced no more. "I think I don't approve of it, mamma," she said. "Not for myself, at least. I believe I know many girls for whom I don't approve of it. They grow too fond of it. It is almost an intoxication. I think they are led on, unconsciously, to say and do things that they would not in more sober moments. And, if some are so influenced, can it be good for others to set them an example in that direction?" All this was satisfaction to the mother, but the daughter's sentence was apt to close with a gentle little afterthought. "Besides, mamma, I don't think I could care to dance now." And that part the mother did not like. After a little she sent Mildred away to new scenes. Fanny Copeland begged for a visit. Mildred was willing to go, perhaps the change would be good for her. It was. She came back improved, energized, perhaps is the word. She had had little or no idea of Christian work in the world. The mother before her had none. This mother was not born for a leader, and came in contact with none who tried to lead her. But Mildred had evidently received an uplift in this direction. She began to question about woman's work. The Woman's Christian Association, the Woman's Christian Temperance Union, the Woman's Missionary Society. What did all these mean? How were they working? "Mamma, why are we not in them?" was the question which startled Mrs. Powers. Mildred, at an afternoon picnic, had been gently pushed forward into the working Christian world, and came home to find her place. The mother was pleased and helpful. She believed in temperance with all her heart. She believed in trying to save young men. But she found herself unwilling to have Mildred think of, pray for, plan for, one young man in Chicago. And that the loyal, trusting heart did just this, she was almost sure. On the whole, the mother could but feel that the bit of the world which she had let take hold of her daughter for a time had sowed its seed, and much she feared the fruit would be tares. Do you understand now why, in a sense, this letter was a relief? Leonard Airedale, who had presumed to be her daughter's friend, a forger, gambler, a drunkard, was miserable enough. But Leonard Airedale, a married man, was an instant and intense relief. Well she knew that girlhood, which at a certain age almost loves to make of itself a martyr, would be blinded with high-sounding words such as sacrifice, and self-abnegation, and soul-saving. But a true, pure-hearted girl would recognize marriage vows, however recklessly taken, as solemn barriers between her and any attempt at self-sacrifice of the sort which this phase sometimes covers. I am glad, though, that Mrs. Powers, with her instant sense of relief, was woman enough and mother enough not to show it just then. She called presently, "Daughter, come here," and the tone was so sweet and so full of tender sympathy that Mildred turned instantly and sank down in a wilted little mass on the floor, and buried her face in her mother's lap. "It is a hard letter, Mildred, and yet a very kind one. I honor the man who wrote it for not glozing over the hard truths in the mistaken name of friendship. We can believe what he says in the future. We will try, daughter, to save the souls of this young man and woman. We will try to save the poor wife from as much misery as we can, shall we not?" Mrs. Powers' voice was firm over the word wife. Mildred must, of course, recognize that fact from the first. There was no answer. There was a long silence, and there were no sobs. At last Mildred's voice. "Mamma, do you might it not have been possible that, if I had corresponded with him and helped him to feel that I was his friend through everything, he might not have gone in this way?" It might have been. This was the miserable thought which was evidently tearing her heart. Her mother made prompt and decisive answer. "My daughter, no. Don't let Satan wring your heart with any such false charge as that. It is one of the most specious lies that he ever invented with which to ruin poor women. The young man who could not be helped by the memory of a pure friendship, and with the possibility of a future such as he held out before himself, could have been only injured by being treated as though he were in every way worthy of respect and friendship. Think of it, Mildred. What do marriage vows mean to him? He was actually planning to desert the poor girl whom he had ruined." "But, mamma, he was not himself when he married her." Mildred's voice was hard. Her mother's probing cut her like a knife. "My daughter, does that excuse him? Will you think for a moment what must have passed between the two before they reached the point where a proposal of marriage would have been possible? It is time, Mildred, that you opened your eyes to this thing wide enough to see that God, in his mercy, has saved you from a bad man. He has all the elements that go to make up a weak and wicked character. I felt it from the first, as you too would have done, had you not been young and trusting, and accustomed to meeting familiarly only those worthy of trust. I prayed God to open your eyes. I take shame to myself, Mildred, that I, who should have been both mother and father to you, was so careless of my trust, and let the world come in with its specious reasoning and steal away my darling. I ought to have shielded you from its snares. I have wept over it bitterly, darling, and I must continue to do so, for I see the experience has left you with a sore heart. You must forgive your mother, Mildred." "Mamma, dear mamma, don't! I cannot bear it. You never did anything that was not just right." Mildred was weeping bitterly now. Her mother held her lovingly, and smoothed the soft bands of hair, and murmured tender words, and felt keenly that the world which she had tried to serve had cast sharp thorns into her darling's experience. But better now than later. Think of that poor, sinned against, ignorant, motherless girl wife in Chicago. While these experiences were being lived in Chicago and Washington, life at Eastwood was by no means at a standstill. Satan was busy, of course. I have often wondered over his tirelessness. Without doubt the Holy Spirit was also at work, but his co-laborers on earth were neither so numerous nor so enthusiastic in many cases as were Satan's, and the immediate results were not so apparent. Still, work was being done. For instance, the temperance element had bestirred itself, as the immediate outgrowth of those Saturday evening prayer meetings, and inaugurated a series of popular temperance meetings. At least they tried to make them popular. They engaged a fairly good speaker, and secured one of the churches, and by dint of much coaxing, prevailed upon a number of young people to take hold of the singing, and placarded the town, giving everybody a cordial invitation to a gospel temperance meeting. The evening arrived, so did the speaker. The singers, a goodly number of them, were in attendance and sung well. But the audience, at least so far as regarded numbers, was certainly a failure. The young man who had come to speak to them, for no other return than the payment of his expenses, had some good things to say, but he had to say them to many empty seats. A few standard temperance people, such as are to be found in every community, were out. 2 ministers were out, and 2 were not, and a great company of Christians and nominal temperance people were at home, or somewhere else. This for various reasons. Some of them did not believe in temperance apart from religion, though who were anxious that this temperance effort should be considered apart from religion did not appear. Some were sure that everything which could be said on the subject had been said, and what was the use in hearing it over again? Some did not like the speaker's politics, and though this was in no sense to be a political lecture, they would have none of him. Some asked to what denomination he belonged, and, on being told, shrugged their shoulders, and remained at home. Some said, "What is the use? I have been to temperance meetings ever since I was a child, and it is all talk. No results ever appear which amount to anything. For my part, I am discouraged." And they, too, stayed away. Well, the people who came listened, and sang, and did what they could, and, at the close of the lecture, the total abstinence pledge was circulated. Then began surprises for some people. A few advanced, and unhesitatingly signed their names, good old deacons and elders who had signed temperance pledges ever since they were children. One minister signed unhesitatingly, the other sat still. People waited for him. He was asked to come at once, so there need be no holding back on his account. No, he would not sign. Why not? Was he not a temperance man? Oh, yes, indeed, to the core. But he did not believe in signing the pledge. A man who, like himself, never touched alcoholic liquors, and who settled this whole question long ago, had no need of pledges. To sign one would be a mere form, and promises were too solemn things to be made thus lightly. Was ever such absurd reasoning known? A pledge a light thing, because a man knew he would keep it. Yet this was what the minister said. But what about the drinking man, who really needed the help of the pledge? No, it was worse than nonsense for him. He couldn't keep it, and he knew he couldn't, and it was simply teaching him to think lightly of a promise. I by no means give you the entire statement, only a glance at some of its remarkable logic. Among those who wouldn't sign was Lloyd McLean. This puzzled and troubled some of his friends, notably Mr. Cleveland and Miss Wainwright. "I thought you were willing to help us," the former said. "So I am, and I'm doing it. Haven't I sung till I'm hoarse?" "The singing is all right, but just now I want the signing. Why do you refuse such a simple thing?" "Partly on account of its simplicity. It is a confession of weakness which I do not choose to make. I'm in no danger from the stuff, and I won't pretend that I am, by going up there and signing." "Not even to help someone else who is in danger?" "Oh, I've no influence with this crowd. There is no one here who knows me. I tried to get Bruce to come. If he were here, I don't know what I might do." And Lloyd McLean sighed. Though he had no conception of the danger in which his friend stood, still he had of late become suspicious that all was not well with him in this direction. Mr. Cleveland caught at the hint. "McLean, he will hear of it. He is sure to hear of everything that is done at this meeting. You can influence him by your action, even though he is absent." But Lloyd shook his head. No, he had always felt a sort of prejudice against the pledge. And there was Dr. Atwood, who evidently felt the same. He might certainly be excused from trying to make a parade of his supposed influence when a minister did not feel the responsibility. There was still another important one who utterly refused to sign his name. That was John Hartzell. No, he never meant to drink again. He wasn't afraid that he should. He had gotten down pretty low, he knew. But a man who couldn't stop drinking when he had made up his mind to, wasn't enough of a man to have any talk over, and wasn't going to be helped, anyhow, by simply writing his name. Lloyd McLean was disturbed at this, and astonished. Why should such a poor wretch as John Hartzell hesitate when he had once resolved to drop the stuff? The man certainly had no dignity to lose, and much to gain by the step. He leaned forward and added his urging to Mr. Cleveland's. "Hartzell, why in the world don't you sign off, and show all these people that you mean business?" "Why don't you?" "I?" said Lloyd. "Why, I have no occasion. They all know that I am a temperate man." "Then it won't hurt you to say so. You won't be singled out for everybody to talk at, as I shall." "Everybody has talked at you for months for the other thing. Give them a chance to alter the story." "I mean to, but I'm not going up there to put it down, as though I had lost all my manhood, and was not to be trusted without that." "Why, Hartzell," said Mr. Cleveland, in almost impatience, "I consider that I am to be trusted, and yet I was the first to pledge myself to-night. It is the people who mean business who are not afraid of pledges." "Then why don't they all go up and sign it? There are dozens sitting around here to-night who shake their heads." "Go up with him, McLean," said Mr. Cleveland, "and show him that there is one less head shaken." But Lloyd drew back. "Excuse me," he said, smiling, yet feeling annoyed and showing it in his tones. "There is a great difference in our position. Hartzell must know that. I never have fallen. I need no props to stand by. I think he is foolish not to be helped when he has proved that he needs it." It was a most unfortunate speech. John Hartzell drew himself up, and the sullen look deepened on his face. "I'm showing folks that I can keep my word without props," he said haughtily. "I have not drank a drop in weeks, and I don't mean to. No, Mr. Cleveland, there is no use in urging me. I'm grateful for all you have done for me and for my family, but I can't turn coward to show my gratitude. I've reformed, and there is no danger of my sinking. I hate my enemies too heartily for that." His face was dark. Mr. Cleveland turned away with a sigh. "Save us from our friends," he said to Miss Wainwright a few moments afterward, when the meeting closed. "There were friends of temperance here to night who did more harm than we can undo in months." "What did that young McLean say?" she asked him. "Oh, the old story. Signing the pledge is a confession of weakness. He does not feel in need of any help of the kind. He is strong-willed and not in any danger. Poor fool!" "Look here," said Miss Wainwright, "I wish you would ask that young man to take care of me home to night. I can't go alone, and he might as well walk along with me as anybody. Just ask it as a favor. I have a word to say to him." Of course, Lloyd McLean was too gentlemanly to refuse such a request, though he had other plans. Miss Wainwright was very pleasant company, and said not a word about the temperance meeting. His nerves, which had been slightly ruffled, were quite toned down by the time they had reached the old Wainwright homestead. Nor did he object in the least to waiting in the great, cheerful sitting room while Miss Wainwright went for a book she had promised to send by him to Mr. Cleveland. Chapter 25 Chapter 27 of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Overdoing. While all these varied experiences were being lived in the Hartzell home, and in the home at Washington, and in the boarding houses of Chicago, life by no means stood still with others of our acquaintance. Fanny Copeland, for instance, was passing through an experience which seemed to her to be all rose color. The days were spent in getting rested after an evening of pleasure, and in getting ready for another of the same character. One of those spasms of activity which seem to take hold occasionally of aristocratic old towns like Eastwood, and to manage them like an epidemic, had seized upon them. Eastwood was gay; that seemed to be the fashionable name for it, and Fanny Copeland was in the fashion. She had sprung into it full-fledged like a newly made butterfly. At Josie Fleming's party, certain in the fashionable set had discovered that she was pretty, and well-mannered and graceful, and the gentlemen liked her, and she helped to entertain some who had heretofore been hard to entertain, and she was Dr. Copeland's daughter, and ought to be noticed, so they noticed her. A tea-party to-day, a ride to-morrow, a social evening with a few friends the next day, and the days flew by. To each and all of these gatherings came Eben Bruce. For the explanation of his sudden freedom from business restraints and the lavish expenditures in which he joined, I shall have to go back a little and tell you of an added misfortune which has recently befallen him. There was a certain well-to-do old uncle, his mother's brother, on whom neither Eben nor his mother had built a single hope, for the reason that the crusty old man was offended with them both. He had earned a fair sum of money in the soap business, and, having no sons of his own, was willing to help his nephew into a comfortable position in the same establishment where he commenced life. He took care to explain the successive steps by which Eben might rise to having an acknowledged name in the firm and a voice in its decisions. But Eben hated the sight and the sound and the smell of soap. He would make no promises, offer no thanks, feel no gratitude. He never could or would be a soap dealer. He wanted to be a physician, and a physician he meant to be. His mother was partly on his side, and partly on the brother's. When she talked with Eben, she spoke boldly of the money advantages of such an offer, and of the possibility that the uncle, having no son, and only one daughter of his own, might leave his nephew a handsome little sum to help him increase his business. When she talked with the uncle, she hinted at the greater respectability of a profession, and the evident talent that Eben had for professional life. The question was an open one for so many months, that finally all parties grew irritable under the strain. Eben declared himself sick and tired of the whole ill-smelling subject, and hoped that nothing would ever be said about it again in his presence. Mrs. Bruce alternately told her son that he had no regard for his mother's comfort, and her brother that he had no sympathy with a talented young man's aspirations after something higher. The uncle finally closed the matter by declaring that his nephew might aspire to the moon if he wanted to, and turn pill-vendor as quick as he pleased, but he need not then, nor ever, expect a penny's worth of help from him. And, to do them justice, they did not. Eben secured a clerkship and spent his evenings in earnest work over medical books; and, up to the day when he attended the picnic in such company as Satan, being on the alert, furnished for him, while the Lord's servants were busy here and there, had held steadily to his purpose. But the uncle, as the years went by, buried his daughter and then his wife, and finally, when in a sudden accident he lost his life while trying to save another, it was found that his will, carefully made and deposited in his lawyer's safe, dated but a few days after his wife's death, left all his nice little property to his nephew, Eben Bruce. News of this sudden uplift in his affairs followed hard on the telegram which announced the uncle's death. So Eben Bruce, who had not intended to take the long journey, changed his mind, threw up his clerkship, and he and his mother went, in deep mourning, to the funeral of the soap dealer. It might not be a pleasant way to make money, but the money proved to be very pleasant to spend, after it was made. Life is certainly a great bewilderment. I often wonder what the hard-working men would say if they could suddenly come back among the living and see the ways in which their fortunes are being used. One cannot help honoring the old uncle for choking down his anger and his sense of ill-treatment, and making his nephew his heir. Yet I suppose that of all the misfortunes which happened to Eben Bruce that winter, the most to be regretted was the one which brought him into possession of a small fortune to do with as he would. The spirit which had been recently roused in him was just the one to be fostered by the knowledge that he had money without working for it, and unlimited time at his disposal. He began well. He set his mother at ease in a boarding house that was suited to her taste, with a comfortable bank account for her use. Then he went back to Eastwood and made prompt arrangements to enter Dr. Copeland's office as a student. It was found to be eminently convenient for Dr. Copeland to have his medical student board with him. So this change was effected. Lloyd McLean looked on at the packing, and even assisted in the preparations for his room-mate's flitting, making, the while, certain dolorous and at the same time comic speeches, which covered a sigh over the easier lot of his fellow-student. "Well, old fellow, good-bye," he said, as they swung the old hair trunk into the hall and watched the porter downstairs. "This is the last of you. One of these days, I suppose, I shall wait for 5 mortal hours in your reception-room, waiting my turn to consult the great Dr. Bruce, and my errand will be to see if you will be so kind as to lend a poor student a work on corns, or bunions, or something or other, that he may study up a case. I shall be gray by that time, and worn to a skeleton, but I shall just have reached the happy hour when I can give all my time to the aforesaid work, with no money with which to buy it; and I shall look up at you with tears in my eyes, and say, 'Sir, I remember you in your earlier days, before the sun of prosperity had dawned upon you. In memory of those old times when we used to eat hash and cod balls together, I trust you will lend me the book.'" And so, with much laughter and nonsense, these two, who had been intimately associated for several months, shook hands, and their lives separated. This will account, in part, for the fact that Eben Bruce ran down rapidly, without the knowledge of his friend. It was easier to do it now. The medical student occupied the room adjoining the doctor's office, and let himself in at any hour of the night, disturbing no one, and appeared always at the breakfast-table, hollow-eyed, it is true, and looking wretchedly overworked, calling upon himself the sympathies of the family, and the warning of the busy doctor not to study late; it did not pay in the end. It was not that Eben Bruce intended to ruin himself. It was not that he sought out evil companions, and went to ruin with them. He drank, for the most part, alone. It was not that he drank what most men would call to excess. It was simply that his sensitively organized, easily excited brain rebelled against the smallest portion of liquid fire. It was simply an unnatural taste for alcohol which had slumbered all unsuspected in his brain, and which had been handed down to him through generations of men who were not drunkards, but who took beer and wine and brandy as tonics, respectably under the physician's orders. Poor Eben Bruce, with his finer nerves and his higher grade of intellect, and his keener sensibilities, could not take these things as tonics, could not be respectable even under the physician's orders. His mother was at fault. She had sipped her beer when he was a creeping baby, to give her strength to care for him. He never thought of blaming his mother for the fire that burned in his veins, and had roused into power the first taste of alcohol. Blessed ignorance of babyhood! He did not know that she was to blame. Miserable ignorance of motherhood! She did not know it either. Neither did she know that he was going swiftly down. She rejoiced over him during those days. They were all ignorant together. Have you never looked on with wide-open eyes that wondered and wondered at the blindness of some concerning their nearest and dearest? Least of all did Fanny Copeland understand. She knew that her father's medical student was coming daily into closer relations with her. that he had dropped the formal Miss Copeland. She was Fanny to him now. In fact, occasionally, when they were quite alone, he had surprised her in some moment of excitement over a discussion by an eager, "My dear Fanny." She had blushed and tried to look unconscious over the slip of the tongue, but acknowledged to herself that it was a very sweet slip, and he spoke the words as though they might have meant a good deal to him. And so the sweet dream went on. The mother looked on not altogether unanxious. She asked the doctor whether his student was perfectly satisfactory, and how long it would be before he could begin to practice; and just what was the sum his uncle left him. Occasionally she said to herself with a half sigh that Fanny was so pretty and so bright, she had hoped, or rather she had fancied, and then she did not tell even herself what she had fancied, but said hastily, "No matter, if they are really attached to each other, and he is a good young man, why, happiness is the best thing, after all." And she thought tenderly of her own poor doctor, who had never yet seen the year in which he did not have to plan carefully so as to hold up his head out of debt, when the annual looking over of accounts fell due. This woman had had other opportunities, more brilliant, but she thought of them with a smile, and knew that one day with the doctor was worth them all. It might be the same with Fanny. And she did not touch by so much as a heart-throb the one element in the case which might mean misery and danger for Fanny. The doctor was equally blind. More so, indeed. Manlike, he looked upon his daughter Fanny as a child under her mother's care. Eben Bruce's attentions were the natural outgrowth of the native politeness of a young fellow whom circumstances had thrown into daily contact with the child. Nothing was serious except the cases of fever and lung troubles which he had on hand just now, and which kept him busy all day and anxious day and night. Perhaps the boy Holly was the only one who could be said to be wide awake. With the peculiar interest which is sometimes so marked in thoughtful boys, he held aloof from Eben Bruce. Not that he disliked him, or was rude to him, or indeed had much to do with him in any way. He seemed simply to stand apart and watch him. "Why doesn't Bruce go to the temperance meetings?" he asked one day, suddenly, as the family lingered at the tea-table waiting for the belated doctor to finish his meal. The student had excused himself, and gone to the office to execute a commission for the doctor. "To the temperance meetings?" repeated his sister. "What meetings? Where are they?" "Why, down in the hall. They have them every Friday night. Good ones, too. Ever so many people sign the pledge. If you were not so busy going to parties and things, you would know all about them." "Do you think Mr. Bruce in special need of attending the meetings, my boy?" It was Mrs. Copeland who asked the question, her voice pleasant, her eyes smiling. She did not know enough about the young man's habits to even imagine that there might be a sting in the question. Holly sent a swift look after his sister, and spoke quickly. "Why, mother, as to that, I think there is a special need of everybody going. Mr. Cleveland goes, and young McLean, and hosts of men who never drink at all." "They are trying to save the drunkards, a kind effort, certainly, but it seems to me rather a hopeless one." The mother's voice was still composed. She had no drunkard to save; she had only a passing interest in any effort of the kind. Holly hesitated. There was something he wanted to say, but he was not sure of the wisdom or the kindness of it. Still he ventured. "I guess they are trying to save some who may be drunkards when they get older, if they don't get started right now. I know one thing, if I were a girl I wouldn't have anything to do with a fellow who wouldn't sign the pledge, not in these times." Fanny laughed, though there was a jarring note in the laughter. "Why, Holly," she said, "have you been engaged to champion the cause? Seems to me you are rather young for a lecturer." "I am not too young to coax people to sign the pledge. I urged Mr. Bruce for half an hour yesterday, and he refused." "Why do you particularly want him to sign?" Mrs. Copeland was the questioner. Her voice simply expressed amusement. The zeal of this young champion for temperance was not all unpleasant to her, but seemed to have the natural overdrawn element of youth in it. "Why, mother, for the same reason that I asked others, to get his name and his influence on the right side. And because—" The truthful boy hesitated, and his cheeks flushed. There was another reason. "Because I thought he might need its help himself. Father, may I be excused and take that package round to Dunlap's now?" "Yes," said his father, "and I must be excused. They are waiting for me at Stewart's, I dare say. By the way, my dear, poor old Joe Hartzell is gone. Died this morning. I suppose poor Kate will need a little help now." "Dead, is he?" said Mrs. Copeland. "Poor wretch! I suppose that is what has just now fired Holly's zeal afresh." But Fanny still played with her spoon. Her cheeks flushed. "Mamma," she said at last, "I think Holly goes among those grown people too much, and gets made too much of. He is growing impudent. The idea of his speaking to Mr. Bruce as he did! And setting up his judgment about the pledge!" "Oh, no," said the mother, "he doesn't mean to be impudent. It is just boyish enthusiasm. He asks everybody to sign the pledge. Why, he coaxed his father into it the other night. I reminded him that he could not take a hot drink, with brandy in it, now, after he had been out in the cold, and he said he would give up all the hot drinks in the country for the boys' sake. And after all, Fanny, we may be glad that his energy takes such a turn. It is a dreadful town. Suppose he went to the bad? Your father was telling me, only last night, of meeting a man who used to know John Hartzell when he was a splendid young man in college. And look at him now. Think what it would be to have a drunkard in our family, Fanny. Holly may better extract pledge signers all over the country than take any such direction. Besides, the temperance meetings are sustained by the very first people. You heard Holly say that Mr. Cleveland always attends them." "Oh, I am not saying anything against their temperance meetings," Fanny said with a restless air. "It is a grand thing to try to get hold of the drunkards, I suppose. But Holly ought not to be permitted to insult young men who haven't time to indulge in such work. I am sure papa thinks Mr. Bruce is overdoing as it is." Chapter 28 of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Where is John? But Miss Fanny Copeland was not to get away from the temperance question that day. It followed her upstairs to her pretty room. She heard Holly's voice below, he had brought the mail, and her mother called to her that there was a letter from Mildred. She went to the head of the stairs to receive it, and promised to come down presently and read it aloud, for her mother was very fond of Mildred. But Fanny did not read that letter to her mother. It was a long letter. There was a brief account of home engagements and plans, and then the writer plunged into the subject which evidently filled her heart. "And now, dear Fanny, at the risk of seeming to force your confidence, I want to ask you whether there is any truth in the rumor, which reaches me through outside parties, that you are very intimate with that Mr. Bruce. We are dear friends, Fanny, you and I, and you must forgive me for speaking plainly. I hope there is nothing in it, because I am afraid for that young man. There is a lady in the mission rooms who has a brother belonging to one of the departments. He visited her yesterday, and had just returned from Eastwood. He visits at the Flemings. You may have seen him, though he says he did not meet you there last week. Well, he had a number of Eastwood names, and among them that of young Bruce. He said it is common report in Fred Fleming's set that the young man is drinking. Fred Fleming declared that it was so, and that something ought to be done to save him. Poor Fred needs saving, you know. It is pitiful, is it not, to think of his trying to save another from coming after him on the downward road? Fanny, I have not been able to think of anything else since I talked with that young man. I am afraid that the reports about Mr. Bruce's habits are too true. It seems this young man, whose name is Weston, used to know a family by the name of Bruce, and interested himself to discover whether this was any connection. So he heard much about him from several sources. I don't credit the report of your intimacy, and shall not, until I hear it from you, because I know how fond Eastwood is of gossiping in those directions. I hope to receive a letter from you by return mail, telling me that it is all nonsense. Still, Fanny dear, I have such a sore heart that I cannot help warning you, even though I hope and pray that it may be unnecessary. You remember Leonard Airedale, of course? You remember how sure you were that he did not drink wine? I liked to hear you say so, yet I did not believe it even then. Something about him made me afraid. I persisted until I found that he did. When he went to Chicago, he was under a very solemn promise to me not to touch another drop. I tried to have him sign a regular pledge, but that he would not do. He said that he considered the pledge made to me more sacred. Fanny, he has gone down, down. Broken that pledge, and every other that an honorable man could. I have been rescued, I suppose, from the depths. I thank God for saving me, but it has been at the expense of a sore heart. That is why I am writing all this to you. I hope I am coming before there has been time for any sick hearts. Fanny, my dear friend, don't trust a man who ever touches a drop of alcohol for medicine, or in any other conceivable way. It has been Leonard Airedale's ruin. Don't trust the common promise of any man who has ever tasted the stuff. There is a demon in it to drag men down. I would not trust any man, save on his knees, asking God's grace to help him keep the pledge which he has taken before God and men. A man who will not take a pledge to help him keep from doing what he says he does not intend to do, is, I believe, in 99 cases out of 100, not sincere, and wants to leave a loophole for his possible indulgence. And any young man who in the light of to-day does not stand squarely in the front of the battle and work with brain and voice, and vote for the cause of total abstinence, is, I believe, not sincere. How can he be, when everybody admits that souls are being ruined by the curse of liquor? Then am I not bound to lift up my voice, and, as soon as I can get a chance, give my vote against it? Suppose I accomplish nothing, has God ever asked me to accomplish? Has he not simply asked me to try? If I try and try and try and fail, will he hold me accountable for the failure? But if I do not try, simply because it seems almost certain that I shall fail, am I free from responsibility? Forgive me, Fanny, I did not mean to write you a temperance lecture, but I feel deeply on this whole question. It has burned me. I would not have you suffer a fraction of what I have. Let me beg you, dear friend, to open your eyes very wide to this question, and take such ground as you will wish you had when we stand at the judgment with all the ruined fathers and sons and brothers and husbands and lovers who are going to meet us there. There was much more, but I have given you enough to show you that Fanny Copeland had her warning. I cannot tell you that she heeded it lightly. She was indignant over it. She cried over it. She was fearful over it. That very Friday evening, when young Bruce came into her mother's parlor and asked if he might rest there until it was time to go to the train for the doctor, she proposed that instead they go, he and she, to the temperance meeting in the hall, and go from there to the train. He had 15 excuses. The night was dark and unusually damp. He was sure her father would not like to have her out. It was a long walk from the hall to the train. Her father was to bring an important piece of medical machinery with him, which must be transported from the train to the office with great care. He should need to take the sleigh. It was not large enough for 3. The proposition began to look unreasonable. Why didn't he attend those meetings occasionally? He had not time. Was he interested in the question? Well, yes, in a sense, all men were. He did not believe in the extreme measures of some. In fact, he was not fanatically inclined in any direction, he believed. And yet Eben Bruce's conscience said to him then and there, "Bruce, you are talking like a fool. If anybody ought to be a fanatic on this subject, you ought, and you know it." Had he signed the pledge? Why, no, he hadn't. When he was a youngster, his mother had not approved of pledges. A little of the old notion clung to him now, he supposed. Then his conscience said again, "No, it isn't, Eben Bruce. That is all nonsense. You have proved it in argument. It is a new notion which clings to you, a feeling that you cannot consent to put it out of your power, morally speaking, to indulge that horrible craving for alcohol which sometimes comes upon you. You are too weak to want to do it, though you hate its chains and are afraid of its power." "Don't you believe in pledges of any kind?" asked Fanny. The young man, under a spell of the earnest eyes which were looking at him, more full of soul than they ever had been before, arose and went over to her side, and dropped into the seat before her, and said, "Yes, I do. I believe in our pledging ourselves, now and here, to be the best and dearest friends to each other that the world has ever known. Will you take that pledge with me, Fanny?" That was a master stroke of the enemy. Fanny, startled, flushed, confused, pleased, forgot caution and fear and the future, and the golden opportunity passed. It was a decent and decorous funeral that they gave the body of poor old Joel Hartzell. Dr. Brandon came and conducted the service. He was no stranger to the house by this time. He had knelt frequently by the silent old man during the weeks past, and asked God to have mercy on his soul. He was familiar with the story of those last days. He had himself seen a gleam of intelligence on the old face that last time he called, and heard a murmured "Amen" to his petition. On the whole, Dr. Brandon read the words, "It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power," over the bruised and battered and sadly ill-used old body, with a sense of awe and wonder and grave delight, such as he did not often experience. To think that there was a Saviour great enough and good enough not only to forgive old Joel Hartzell, but to raise up for him a glorious body, without spot or wrinkle, or any such thing. "Verily, we have a wonderful Saviour," he said to Mr. Cleveland, as the two stood together over the wreck that life and death had made, and saw, both of them, the look of something almost like dignity that the old face had taken up in its last sleep. "Aye, that we have," said Mr. Cleveland. "And their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. That is wonderful too. No human being can think of old Joel as a saint, but God will." Miss Wainwright's carriage held John and his wife and Kate. Mr. Cleveland's carriage led the way, with the minister beside him; and there followed a carriage which held Miss Wainwright and Miss Hunter, and another with the doctor and Holly. This little bit of thoughtfulness touched Kate almost more than any of the numberless other kindnesses had. It was so unexpected, and, in the eyes of the world, so unnecessary. Do you know just how strange the house to which they returned seemed to them? It was in nice order. The bed had been neatly made up, and was empty. The little stand which had stood at the head of the bed, and held glasses and spoon, and lamp, all needful things, was empty, save for the little lamp, which, newly filled, stood waiting for them. Kate lighted it, for the early twilight was already setting in, and shaded it from the bed; then quickly took the shade away. There was no need for it now. She sat down in the rocking chair, which had been brought from somewhere weeks ago, for her comfort, and folded her hands and looked about her. It was a strange feeling. She was at leisure. The occupation which had held body and mind for weeks was gone. There was a strange sense of desolation. She had not thought to deeply mourn her father, but one night, that last night of his life, he had said to her, "Kiss me, Kate, you used to when you were a little girl. Poor Kate, I shall be out of your way in a little while. I meant to take such good care of you. I promised her I would, and I didn't. I don't know but she will be disappointed at seeing me. Do you think she will?" And Kate had answered quickly, "Oh, no, father, oh, father, no! She will be glad, and I will come." "And John?" he had said quickly, with an upward inflection in his voice; and she had said it after him assuringly, "And John." It took with her all the sacredness of a pledge. As she thought of this last talk, the tears came thick and fast. She was missing her father. Yet there was a strange sweetness in the tears. It was so blessed to think that he lived even so little bit of a life that could be sweetly missed. Mrs. John Hartzell went about softly preparing the neat supper. She was sorry for Kate. She had never thought to feel a shadow of regret for the father whom she had known only as a trial. But there had been some last words, in the stillness of the night, spoken also to her. She did not tell them, but she treasured them. Thus in silence and peace the evening gathered around them. Suddenly wife and sister awoke at once to the same question, a startled look in the eyes of both. "Where is John?" "He went home with the chairs from the corner," Mrs. Hartzell said, "and he said that while he was about it he would step down to Dunlap's and get a little flour. I must bake to morrow, and the flour is all gone. But I thought he would be back before this time. I told him we would have tea early." Kate gave a quick little exclamation, as quickly suppressed, but it sounded a note of warning to the wife. She looked up, startled. "Why, Kate, you don't think—" And then she stopped. Her face blanched with fear. She had not thought of it before. It was so easy to learn to trust one's husband when one wants to trust him, and John's step had been so firm during the past weeks. It was not possible that she was to be plunged back into the living death from which she had been creeping up. Could she bear it? Would not the merciful grave which they had seen closed that afternoon open again and take her in? Could she bear the suspense for an hour? She rose up and began to walk rapidly back and forth in the little room. "Kate," she said fiercely, "you don't think—you can't believe—" "I don't know," said Kate, drawing a hard, slow breath. "John is tired. He has been under a heavy strain, and he has been excited all day. And there are fiends abroad in the town." Do you think they will ever forget that evening, these two women, sitting beside the empty bed watching out of the west window and the south window? Glancing now and then at the untasted supper on the table, listening to the dreary song of the neglected tea kettle, listening constantly for the sound of footsteps which came not. They did not sit inertly. They went, first the wife and then the sister, out into the night and the darkness, down the steps, down the lane, out to first one corner and then the other, and crept back after a little, alone, frightened, almost maddened with anxiety and fear. Before the midnight of that awful night was reached, earth seemed to the two to contain nothing sweeter than that lately closed grave. Oh, to be hidden out of sight and sound within its quiet arms! It was midnight when John Hartzell came home. His wife was out on the steps peering down into the darkness. She heard him, stumbling, swearing, knocking violently at a post which he fancied ran against him. She shrank into shadow as he passed her. But she need not have cowered back. He was too drunk to see her in the dim twilight. He stumbled into the house and sank down a limp heap on the broken step. "Oh, God!" she said. "Oh, God!" Do you think it was not a prayer, and that the pitying God will not see that she is avenged? Kate had fled to the little closet room, from whence, after the drunkard had thrown himself on that neat and so recently vacated bed, and was lost to sound, she stole out in search of the wife. "Oh, Annie," she said in low and pitiful tones, "poor Annie, come in, dear. You will die out here in the cold. He will not hear us. Come, let me help you in." And the poor wife looked up at the young girl, her eyes tearless, her face white with agony. But she only repeated that solemn, awful name. "Oh, God!" "God is in heaven, Annie, and he hears. Be sure he hears. The time is coming when he will avenge his own. We belong to him, Annie, and father belongs to him. Let me help you in." And she fairly lifted the stricken wife in her arms and bore her into that closet where the rest of that night was spent. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Only a question of time. How did it happen? Who can tell all the hows of these things? Why is it that just at the wrong moment people who have been on the alert for weeks must relax their vigilance? On almost any other evening of the previous month it would have been impossible for John Hartzell to have eluded all the friends who were bent on saving him. But on this particular evening they went their various ways, apparently so satisfied because God had interposed and forever saved old Joel Hartzell, that they forgot the human side of the struggle and went home to rest. Mr. Cleveland, in slippers and dressing-gown, sat before his open grate and told his mother about the look of dignity with which death had touched even the old man's features, and said, reverently, "Though I believe it was not death, but immortal life, which left that impress. Is it not wonderful to think of old Joel in heaven?" It was about that time that old Joel's son descended again into the mouth of hell. He did not intend it. Oh, no, I do not suppose there has yet lived a man who intended deliberately to descend from respectability into ruin. He returned the chairs, and in a grave and manly way expressed his thanks. He went into the grocery and bought and paid for a small sack of flour. In doing so he took out and held in his hand for a moment several quarters and a $50 while he counted out the change. I will not say that there was not a sense of satisfaction in so doing. There was such a recent past in which to have counted out money for flour would have seemed to him almost a miracle. The grocer was friendly, and held him for a moment in conversation. He had ordered him from his doorstep more than once, but if a man was going to be respectable and jingle money in his pocket, it was as well to look out for custom. On the steps stood two young fellows, gay, thoughtless, not exactly heartless, save as rum had silenced their higher natures. "Look at John," said one. "He is counting out the quarters as though they grew on the Flats." "They are crowing over him down at the temperance meetings. He is quite the fashion, I hear. A brand plucked from the burning. Still, I heard that he wouldn't sign their pledge." "Oh, no, he won't. He prides himself, they say, on his iron will. Think of John Hartzell with a will so iron that a glass of whiskey wouldn't bend him." Then they laughed. "Do you suppose he will stick?" This from a third young man, one with a meaner face than the others. One of those low, laughing faces belonging to the fellow who has sunken low enough to do anything just for a joke. "Stick? No, of course he won't. It is only a question of a few days. When one sees the disgusting fuss that is being made over him, one is tempted to wish that he would hurry up and get back into the gutter. Did you see that parade at the funeral of old Joe to-day? Carriages and all that sort of thing. That fellow Cleveland, who thinks he was born to rule the country, leading the procession, looking as solemn as a priest. I would like to see that man brought down in some way. He is so far above the common people that he will hardly bow to them on the street." What is the meaning of this astonishing confusion of logic? Only personal pique and political differences of opinion. Mr. Cleveland did not, it is true, recognize this young man as a friend. They had not a thought in common. That they had quarreled could not be said, because Mr. Cleveland would not quarrel; but that they differed essentially on all questions was true, and in the nature of things necessary. Either oil or water must change its nature before both can mix. Then spoke the nature which was on the alert for fun. "It would be a rich thing to see the faces of the fanatics when their pet tumbles again." "I declare I should like to be around. I wonder how long the reform will last." "I wouldn't be afraid to wager that I could have him in a state which would edify my Lord Cleveland by 10 o'clock to-night." "Oh, no, not so soon as that. He has just buried his father, you know." "What of that? Much he cared for his father. Haven't you heard him swear at him like a trooper? I tell you, John Hartzell is playing a game on the rich old maid. That is all he is about." "If I thought that, I'd like to expose him." Don't think I am going to give you the entire scene. I have only hinted at the motives which were brought to bear on the three natures, as they stood on the steps and watched John Hartzell with his silver. They had never moved in his set, those three. They were several grades above him. It was, therefore, an added pat to his pride when they accosted him in a friendly way and expressed sympathy with him in his recent affliction. It was a most unusual thing that they should walk along the street with him. Was he at work now on anything in particular? Asked the young fellow who was searching for fun. Did he know Burton of the Lower Mill? He was looking for a reliable man to secure permanently. Perhaps Hartzell would like the chance. Step in here and let us wait for him. He will pass presently on his way uptown. In here was a saloon of the better sort. It had a soda fountain in summer, and a refreshment table in winter where oysters were served, and it was patronized occasionally by thoughtless temperance people when they wanted cigars or oysters, and did not want to go uptown any farther. John did not hesitate. He had reformed. He never meant to drink another drop of intoxicating liquor. He was as ignorant of his own heart as ever a baby was. He prided himself on his strong will. He was not afraid to go into saloons. "Have a glass of beer, Hartzell? No? You have discarded the whole thing, have you? Why, I thought beer was innocent enough. Well, some people have to deny themselves, I suppose." Was there a covert sneer in the tone? Was there a hint that he could not drink a glass of beer if he wanted to? Wild and preposterous to you as it may seem, he honestly thought he could. What, John Hartzell, who only a few weeks before had told Miss Wainwright that he had tried 1,000 times to give up the stuff, and could not? Yes, the very man. Don't you see, he had done it. 6 weeks since a drop of liquor had been tasted. The work was accomplished, so he thought. The battle fought. He was a free man now. Yet the smell of that beer, as the gentleman quaffed it, made him fairly dizzy with its suggestions. And yet he was not warned. Don't expect me to explain it. I verily believe there is no human explanation which can fit the story. But don't you know by your own observation all about the strange, blind infatuation and foolhardiness of the reformed drunkards who are trusting to their own will power? If you do not, you are certainly not a very experienced temperance worker. Where were the temperance workers that evening? Why did there not pass by a man who could help this tempted soul who yet did not understand himself well enough to know that he was in mortal danger? One passed by who might have helped. At least, he might have tried. He did not go blindly. He paused and thought of the danger. That one was Charlie Lambert. A temperance man? Oh, yes, he drank no liquor. He had no temptation to drink any. A pledged man? Oh, no, he saw no occasion for that. Certainly not, so far as he was concerned. An advocate of the license system? Well, hardly, and yet it was certainly better to have this thing regulated by law if people must have it among them. Oh, then he believed in getting it out from among them? Well, no, he did not consider that expedient. In fact, it was something which could not be done. Why not? Well, the country was not ready for it. How was the country to be gotten ready for it? By continuing to accept the business as legal and under protection? Oh, well, he was not a fanatic on this subject. He believed in individual opinion. And in this way could Charlie Lambert dance around in a peck measure for a whole week at a time, and call it arguing. Still, he did not believe in drunkards. Oh, no, it was a disgraceful thing to get drunk. In fact, I tell you he did not believe in moderate drinking. He had not so much excuse as that for his slippery position. He knew John Hartzell, and he saw him distinctly in that saloon, and paused, and said to himself, "That is no place for that fellow. He ought to know better." Why didn't he go in, and at least look as much in the face of John Hartzell? There was one curious reason why he did not. 1, 2, 3, 5 young men he saw in there, who were acquaintances of his. Friends indeed, in a general way. The proprietor of the saloon was a good fellow. He often took his lunch at that place. He had stopped there for soda almost every day during the summer. What an embarrassing thing for a young man like him to step in there and try to rescue John Hartzell! It was too much to expect. After all, John might be only waiting for something. Besides, he would go to drinking again, of course. No confidence could be placed in the reformation of such drunkards as he. And Charlie Lambert passed by on the other side. "Come now," said the gentlemanly proprietor. "You fellows are getting too noisy. We don't have such scenes in here. Some of you must get Hartzell out of here. This is no place for him." This was 2 hours after Charlie Lambert had passed. By that time the respectable oyster saloon was no place for him. He must go lower down. One of the loungers agreed to take him by the arm and lead him away. "Coax him home, Jimmy," whispered the gentlemanly fellow who had started out for fun. He had had his fun, and someway it left a bitter taste. Jimmy nodded, but he might as well have undertaken to coax a panther back into its cage after it had scented its prey. What John Hartzell wanted now was rum, and rum he would have. A whistling boy went past just as he reeled into a more pronounced saloon lower down. The whistling stopped, and the boy stood for a moment horror-stricken. It was surely John Hartzell. What could he do? Where was everybody? He stood only a moment, then ran on swift feet around the corner. Dr. Brandon's house was the nearest, but Dr. Brandon was not at home. He hurried up the stairs to Lloyd McLean's boarding house, but Lloyd McLean's room was dark and his door was locked. Then home, father might have come, and father would go to the rescue. No, Dr. Copeland had not returned. The boy was panting and almost breathless. He burst into the parlor, where sat Fanny and Mr. Bruce. He had but one question to ask. "Do you know where Mr. McLean is?" No, certainly Eben Bruce did not know. He had not seen McLean in a week. What was the matter? "They must have got hold of John Hartzell," Holly said, still breathless. "They are making him drink. If I knew where he was, I guess he would know something to do. He is with the others a great deal." The pronouns in the latter part of the sentence referred to Lloyd McLean. Then the boy rushed away. Fanny and her friend looked at each other. "Poor fellow," said Fanny. "He is almost wild over that wretch of a John Hartzell. He was so attached to Kate. He seems to be determined that John shall reform. I suppose nothing is more hopeless. It is only a question of time when people get as low as he." Eben Bruce shivered a little. "Yes," he said slowly, "I suppose it is only a question of time." Holly rushed to his mother. "Oh, mother, if you would let me just run down to Mr. Cleveland's. I can go in 15 minutes. I came home at 9:30 as you said. But they have got hold of him, the fellows have, and they are making him drink. Mr. Cleveland would know what to do. May I go, mother? Say yes, quick, do, please. I have lost so much time already." Could she let him go? He was only a boy, and the streets were full of snares for boys. And it was the wildest sort of an idea. What could Mr. Cleveland or any man do? Poor miserable wretch! Of course he would drink. As if anybody did not know that. She was sorry for Kate. Yes, she was genuinely sorry. She had sent her a black cashmere dress to wear to the funeral, and a black wrap, which she told her to keep. But Kate had been utterly wild to hope anything for that miserable brother. It was a good thing that the father had died. It was an infinite pity that the brother had not died years ago. Holly must not think of such a thing as going out again. It would do no good, it might do great harm. Then Holly went away to his room. He kissed his mother good night, mournfully, his lip quivering and quivering, so that he could hardly bear it. Once in his room, the door locked, he sat down, all hot and trembling as he was, and cried great burning tears. Then he walked up and down the room, even as Kate and John Hartzell's wife were doing at that moment. "I hate it," he said, clenching his hard young fist. "I hate it. I wish I were a man this minute. I would do lots of things. I would have rooms, bright, light rooms, and people on the watch, and a man at every corner to run to when folks were in trouble, and I would fight it all ways at once, and I will. I'll fight until there is not a drop to be had on the globe. That's the thing. None to be had. Then they can't get it. That will end the matter, and I believe it is the only thing that will. God wants it so, for he says that no drunkard shall go to heaven, and rum makes drunkards, and always has, and always will. Then people who want folks to go to heaven have got to get rid of the rum. There is no other way." I am glad to tell you that this boy got down at last on his knees. There he sobbed out his bitter story, and from thence he arose calmed. He had done what he could. It is true that the sum of it had been nothing. But the divine heart whispered to him, "Never mind, my boy. God knows, and God reigns." Well, there is a rift, I suppose, in every cloud, however dark. In the midst of all these bitter scenes, Holly Copeland's education was progressing. Chapter 29. Chapter 30 of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Vigilance Committee. They had heard it the next day. Lloyd McLean was told by his old friend Eben Bruce. "Were you found last night by a young whirlwind?" he asked, as the two met on the street and shook hands, and then Eben explained, and was questioned, and cross-questioned. "No, you don't tell me that the fiends got hold of him! Confound this thing! Eben, you and I ought to go into it with a will. I hear of new victims every day. Who knows what will come next? You look wretchedly, Eben. Are you overworking, or what? No need to rush so now, man. Why don't you take it easily? And nobody went to the rescue as far as you know? That was dreadful. What were you about, that you did not go yourself?" He waited for no answers, but hurried away. At the post-office door stood Mr. Cleveland. "Have you heard—" began Lloyd, and then stopped. Yes, he had heard, and his face had actually seemed to age under it. "I am broken down," he said, almost tremulously. "I dare not go around there, McLean. What can we do? If he only had felt less confidence in himself! If I had only stayed with him last night! But I did not dream, and yet I might have known. It was just the time." If the young fellow who had been the evening before in search of fun could have looked on the foiled worker's face just then, he might have seen effect enough certainly to have afforded him fun of his sort for some time to come. There was more of it at the Hartzell home, whither Mr. Cleveland presently went. "Where is he?" he asked, holding out his hand to Kate, saying not another word. "We do not know." "What! They told me he came home. They watched him, some of them." "Yes, and we let him slip away." Her face crimsoned as she said it. "I don't know how we could, but I was frightened for Annie. After I got her into the house she had a sort of fit. I could not rouse her, and then she moaned and cried in an unnatural way; and when, hours after, she grew quiet, and I thought her asleep, I would not move for fear of disturbing her, and I sat and held her. When at last she stirred, and sat up, and looked about her, she said, 'I haven't been asleep. Did you hear a noise? I am afraid he is gone.' We came out here at once, and he had. It was just in the gray morning, just at the time that father went home, Mr. Cleveland. I heard no noise, but Annie thinks she did. She thinks he must have awakened enough himself to remember, and then, in shame and misery, have slipped away from us. She mourned so that she was not beside him to have held him. I don't know what to do with her. I am afraid she will lose her reason." She looked like it. Hollow-eyed woman. No tears to shed. Her eyes looked as though they might burn rather than weep. Mr. Cleveland gave her his hand in utter silence. He felt rebuked, appalled. Had he been unfaithful to his trust? Why did he not stay by the wreck until it was placed in safer harbor? He who knew so well that wreckers were abroad. The wife was the first to speak. "We must find him, Mr. Cleveland." Some way the words gave him courage. "Yes," he said quickly, "and we must save him. It will not do to sit down and count all lost because he has fallen again. Perhaps we should have expected that." Before he could say more, there was a rush up the broken step, and Holly Copeland stood beside them. "Oh, Kate," he began, his voice eager, "I did not get anything done, but I tried so hard. And, Kate, I'll tell you, While the rum is all over, as it is, there is no way to do but to watch it and fight it all the time. We must just get rid of it, or there will be no peace, ever." He said it in such a tone of quiet conviction, as though that question were settled for all time, that Mr. Cleveland could hardly forbear a smile. Then Holly had his story to tell, and its recital did not make the self-reproachings of the man who listened any easier to bear. "We were all unfaithful," said Kate. "Annie and I ought to have held him. I did not think. It seemed to me last night that for hours my heart would only take in one thought, and that was that father was safe forever." "God saved father, and God must save John. Nobody else can." It was the wife who spoke, and her words took hold of the listeners with the power of a conviction. "Amen," said Mr. Cleveland. Then came a conference as to what to do first. "Is your faith equal to the strain?" This was the question which Mr. Cleveland asked of Kate as he turned to her to say good-bye. They had planned what there was to do. For the women it was that hardest part, to wait at home. In the meantime, men were to be placed on the alert, a sort of impromptu vigilance committee formed, whose first object would be to decoy John Hartzell back to his home. After that they must plan the next step. It was not to be easy work. They all felt that. John Hartzell had been too hard a drunkard to yield the struggle easily, now that the demon was roused again. "I do not know," Kate said, a wan smile on her face. "I do not know whether the name of it is faith or presumption. When he saved father, it seems to me such an easy thing for him to save John, if only John will." "Yes," the listener said, "that is the only 'if.' God must be true to himself, or he would not be God." Then he went away and left them to their harder task. All day the watching and the searching availed nothing. Apparently John Hartzell had dropped from the ranks of the living as completely as his father had. Perhaps the most disgusted member of the vigilance committee was Lloyd McLean. In his eager search all the early part of the evening, for it was not until evening that he could be released from office duty to enter systematically upon his work, he came in contact with more of the low and revolting features of rum than he had ever even imagined. "No, he ain't here, my hearty," said a drunken wretch in answer to the young man's inquiry as he opened the door of one of the lowest dens. "I ain't seen John Hartzell this blessed day. Shouldn't wonder if he had gone and drowned himself out of respect to his father. It is a great thing to lose a father. I lost one once myself. Come in and have a drink in memory of it. I know you. Why, yes, of course I do. You're one of us, ain't you? I saw you the other night up at the hall, when them fellows was whimpering around with their pledge. We don't sign no pledges, do we, you and me? We believe in liberty of conscience and free speech and all that sort of thing, don't we? Come in, my friend, and treat the resolution to be men. No, sir, no pledges for us." And he gave the disgusted young man a familiar slap on the shoulder, as he would have done to a boon companion. Lloyd McLean slammed the door hard, to drown the coarse laughter of those who were not too drunk to appreciate the joke, and walked down the street with a face whose color deepened as he thought. The hall where the temperance meetings were held was the place of rendezvous for the searchers, and thither he went to find Cleveland alone. "Any news?" asked the latter eagerly. "No, there isn't. I haven't received the suspicion of a trail. I say, Cleveland, I've seen and heard enough to-night to make a man feel sure that there must be a place in reserve for lost souls. And I've seen something else. I wish it were Friday night. I hope we can work up such a rousing meeting as this town has never seen. And if you will have 50 total abstinence pledges here, I will sign them all. And then let us organize a permanent league, and have a fund, and go to work in dead earnest. This thing has been handled with gloves on long enough. I tell you what it is, I'm roused." "Good," said Mr. Cleveland. The saloons are getting better than they imagine, after all. They are at work educating workers. But in the meantime, my friend, where is John Hartzell?" In order to explain to you where he was at that moment, I shall have to return to the Hartzell home and the people waiting there. Little had been said all day. Kate had prepared food with care and a certain degree of daintiness, prepared it with reference to the possibility of one coming who would be faint and burning with unnatural thirst. But no one came, and the food remained almost entirely untouched. Kate tried to sew, and seemed unable to set the stitches. She tried to read, and the words seemed only to be, "Where is John? Father is safe, but where is John?" Thus the day dragged its slow length away. Suddenly, as twilight was settling on them again, Mrs. Hartzell sprang up with a new determination in her face. "I'm going there to watch. I wonder I did not think of it before. I won't come back without him, Kate, you will see." "Where, Annie? Where are you going?" "To the little room, the little, bright room. Didn't Miss Hunter tell you about it? We passed it once, John and I, that night we took a walk, and I told him about it. I'm going there to watch. You stay here, Kate, and be ready if he should happen to come home. But I can't wait another minute. So many people keep going by that room, he must be among them." And Kate was silent. It was a dreary place for a young girl to sit down alone, with only a vacant bed and the thought of a grave to keep her company. But she could see that whether the bright little room ever did anything for John or not, it might save his wife's reason. So she helped her on with the worn bonnet and the faded shawl. And the poor creature, who had heard, before God, the pledge that she should be loved and cherished until death parted them, went her way to watch for the one from whom worse than death had parted her. All night she stayed alone in that bright room. People passed, and talked and laughed, and whistled and sang, and swore. But John Hartzell was not among them. The town hushed itself into quiet after a while, but still that light burned, and the shades were stretched high. Miss Hunter slipped down from her room above once in a while, and looked on the watcher now kneeling by the window, looking up to the stars, and to the God above the stars, and shook her head and went back to pray. Once she came, and, touching the kneeling figure, said, "You are to eat a bite now. It won't do to be all run down when he comes, so that you haven't strength to hold on to him." The plea reached the watcher's mind, and she ate and drank with resolute air, like one who was resolved to be strong. Who would have supposed that the frail, sheltered, white-robed, pink-ribboned darling of the years long gone could wait and watch and endure like this? Yet the night and the day went by, and he did not pass. Where was he? Skulking. That is the only word for it. A miserable, shamefaced, utterly cowed, despairing man. He had drank to drunkenness, he had spent his last cent, he had pawned his hat, he had been kicked out, he had stumbled to his old home, he had slept the drunkard's sleep, he had awakened, not enough himself to realize his misery, but to realize only that he must have more rum. Yet rum he could not get. The Vigilance Committee was at work before he had made many attempts, and by 10 o'clock of the morning not a rumseller would have dared to furnish John Hartzell with liquor. There were certain who could have hinted as to his whereabouts at intervals during the day, had they chosen to do so, but it suited their policy to be entirely ignorant. So it was that, by evening of the second day, he was sober and desperate. He had lost all trust in himself, all hope in others. He had settled it a dozen times within the hour that he was a lost man, that there was no hope for him in this world or the next, that he wanted nothing, hoped for nothing, but liquor, and, unless he could have that, he should go mad. He had settled it that he would never go home again. He would get away as far as possible, then he would beg or steal or anything to get enough alcohol to kill him. This, as nearly as he can be said to have had a plan, was the plan of the miserable man who was hiding himself alike from enemies and friends. Mrs. Hartzell went home in the early morning, after her night's vigil. She shook her head in answer to Kate's inquiring look, but she shook it with a faint little smile. "Kate," she said, going over to her, "he has not come yet, but I think he will. I have something to tell you. I have learned to pray. Did you know it? I cannot think how I came to give way so entirely the other night after I had found God. I did not think I ever should again, but it came upon me so suddenly. Some way I had trusted him entirely. Now I am trusting God. He will not fail me. I think John will come." She did not say much more. She ate her breakfast steadily, with the air of one determined to conquer the utter want of appetite. She slept a good deal during the day, with the air of one preparing for conflict. At dusk she came out with the old bonnet on. "I hate to leave you alone, Kate, but you must stay, lest he should come, and I must go and watch, for fear he will not come." "I know," said Kate. She spoke as one almost awed. She did not know this resolute sister-in-law. She could but think that this was courage born of God. Chapter 31 of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Night to Remember. Mr. Cleveland, when he came to learn if possibly something had been heard from the lost man at his home, found Kate there alone. "This will not do," he said positively, when he took in the situation. "It will not do at all. You cannot stay in such a neighborhood as this alone." "I must," said Kate, gravely, "and therefore I can. It is my part of this tragedy. We must not desert the only place he knows as home, lest he might come." "But is there not somebody to stay with you?" She shook her head. "Nobody from whom I do not shrink more than from solitude. There are few neighbors here, and those not of a sort to depend on in time of need." "Where is the woman whose baby died?" "Watching over the next one, who is also going to die. The world is full of sorrow for some, Mr. Cleveland." He turned from her abruptly, with the briefest possible good night. It was then 9 o'clock. He went with long, swift strides down the street, making no pauses until he reached Miss Wainwright's home. Then he gave such a jerk to the bell knob as brought that energetic woman herself, but a step behind, Keziah, to see what was the matter. "What is it?" she asked, the moment she caught sight of the messenger. "Any news?" "No news at all. We are watching every street corner, and every rum hole in town. It does not seem possible, if he is alive, that he can elude us much longer. Miss Wainwright, she is quite alone in the house, in that neighborhood." "Who is?" "Kate, utterly alone. Not even a neighbor to call upon. If he should come home in the night, raving, as he is liable to do, or if a dozen other things should happen, what would become of her?" "Where is the wife?" "Gone to Miss Hunter's bright little room to watch. It is a heaven-born idea; but it makes it no less desolate and dreadful for Kate. Can you think of anything to do? Is there some woman who can be hired to go there for the night?" "No," said Miss Wainwright, speaking slowly, "I do not suppose there is; at least, if there is, I am not acquainted with her. Miss Hunter would go, but she is looking after the poor wife, I suppose. Well, I asked the Lord to give me work in the cause. To be sure, I did not expect it to come in this form, but work isn't apt to come in the form in which you have planned it. I have always noticed that. I'll be ready in 10 minutes, Mr. Cleveland. Come in." "You?" said Mr. Cleveland. It was genuine astonishment. Miss Wainwright was never known to spend a night away from her beautiful old home. "To be sure, what else is there to do? Come in where it is warm. Keziah, get my things, and bring the wicker basket I packed this afternoon. You can carry it, can't you, Mr. Cleveland? It isn't very heavy." "Keziah might go," she said, lowering her voice as she looked after the astonished handmaiden. "But Keziah, though a jewel in some respects, is a nuisance in others. The fact is, she is a coward. If I were to send her down there, I should expect her to die of 1,000 imaginary evils before morning, besides making a nuisance of herself generally to poor Kate. Oh, I'll go, of course. There is nothing else to do." "But you cannot walk there, my dear Miss Wainwright. I will go for my carriage. I can have it here in 10 minutes." "No, you won't. I can walk well enough if I choose. I am not over fond of walking, and I see no reason why I should do it for pleasure, since there is no pleasure in it. But I can walk on occasion, and would rather do it than ride after those horses of yours in the night, especially over on the Flats. Peter has a cold. I sent him home early with orders to soak his feet and go to bed, or you might go over for him. But there is no need, I can walk." She was as good as her word. Ready in less than 10 minutes, and they were out together in the clear starlight. As they passed the brightly lighted hall, Mr. Cleveland gave, incidentally, a bit of information. "We had the largest temperance meeting to-night we have had at all, and the most enthusiastic one. Some of our friends are getting pretty thoroughly roused. This thing has stirred their blood. Lloyd McLean went forward the moment the opportunity was given, and put his name to the total abstinence pledge, and has been working like a general for signers ever since. I left the meeting in his charge when I came away." "Thank the Lord," said Miss Wainwright. There was a ring in her voice which he noticed as peculiar. "Why didn't you tell me that before?" she demanded. "I forgot for the moment that the ladies were not out at the meeting this evening. Why, are you particularly interested in him?" "I am particularly interested in all young men. And besides," added the truthful voice, after a moment of silence, "I knew his father once." "Ah, yes, I remember." But there was very little that he knew to remember. The son of an old friend, this was enough to account for a special interest. He had felt a peculiar interest himself in the bright young man, and there had always been a fear that he was in danger from the gay world. The stand taken this evening had given him a momentary feeling of joy, but the experiences of the past few days were so absorbing him that it had quickly passed from his mind. As they turned the corner which led to the Flats, Mr. Cleveland said, "She stayed all alone in the house last night. It ought not to have been. This is no place for an unprotected young girl like her. Miss Wainwright, I don't know how to thank you for this night's sacrificing kindness." "Why should you thank me?" asked this plain-spoken woman. "Why, is it anything to you?" To this no sort of answer was given, and the rest of the walk was taken in complete silence. It was after midnight again, and the town was still. Revelry there might be behind closely drawn shades or close folding shutters, but the respectable portion of the old town was, for the most part, in bed. Houses were dark. There was starlight and a late moon, therefore the street lamps were not lighted. One window was bright. The little cheery room, with its bright fire burning in the grate, its 2 rocking chairs, drawn up to the table, waiting. Its big old Bible on the stand showed plainly to the passer-by. At the window there knelt again a woman. She had shaded the light in the early evening, when many were passing, and shaded herself from public gaze as well as she could, and, at the same time, not lose the sight of any face. But now the light burned up brightly, and she watched and waited. Suddenly she gave a quick spring forward into the night. "John!" she said, her voice low and clear. "John!" and she caught at the sleeve and held on. "Let me alone," said a muffled voice. "Let me go." She held on, and held with force, and drew him by sheer force backward a step. She had carefully kept up her strength all day for this moment. "John, oh, John, come in here. See, I am all alone. It is a nice place. No one will see you or hear. I have waited and waited for you." He tried to hold back even then, but she drew him by the power of her stronger will. He was fairly within the little bright room at last. She shut the door with a quick backward motion and turned the key, and drew it from the lock. Then she drew down the shades. The outside world must not look in now. "John," she said, Sit down, poor John, and tell me all about it. They got hold of you, and you did not mean it. I know you did not. I trust you fully, John. You did not mean to go away from me ever again, but they got hold of you before you knew it, and then you were not willing to come home. I know all about it. You need not tell me. You are hungry. You must eat. I have supper waiting for you." She slipped into the outer room, the speck of a kitchen. The key was in her pocket. There was a bit of a cook stove there, and something hot and nourishing simmered on it. Miss Hunter herself was bending over it, rapidly dishing it up. She had a cup by her side, and she set down the bowl and poured coffee, hot and strong. "Give him this," she said. The wife's eyes were shining like coals. "Take this to him. I will get the other ready." Mrs. Hartzell seized the cup and went back to her husband. A night to remember? I should think so. As long as memory lasts to John Hartzell's wife, either on this side or the other, she knows that she will remember every word and look, and almost every thought of that night, as though it were photographed in pictures of flame before her. It was more than that. It was cut into her heart. She dealt with a soul on the very verge of human despair. You know nothing about the drunkard's despair. You cannot imagine it. Neither, they tell me, can I. I have heard one talk, and his picture was so vivid that it seems to me at times I can imagine the scene, yet what must it be to feel it? He drank the coffee, drank it with a feverish thirst, but he did it sullenly. He asked her why she was there. He told her that it was all over, that he had given up, that he had been in hell for the last 36 hours, and he knew that such was his portion. She must let him go. Why had she brought him there to torture him? His misery was deep enough now. He was going away where he would never trouble her or Kate any more. They would never hear of him again. To all of which she made answer only in a quiet, matter-of-fact way, "John, eat that, or drink this." Her excitement seemed to be gone. She was as still as the night, and as gentle in her tones and ways as a child. When she felt that he had taken all the nourishment she dared to give, she set aside the empty cup, and came and knelt down before him. "John, look here, I am not going to be deserted. I will not be. It is folly for you to talk in that way to me, for you cannot get away from me. We promised ourselves to each other forever, and there is no such thing as getting away from it. I will go with you to the world's end if you say so, but remember I am to be with you. John, you know the sort of life your father lived, but you must forget that and remember the way he died. 'Annie,' he said to me that last night, 'remember this, God has saved me, and he can save anybody. That proves it. Do you never give up John for a minute. We must spend eternity together to make up for the way we have thrown away time.' I promised him, John, and I mean to keep the promise. And now I want to tell you another thing. You can begin life over again, and make up here. Father waited too long, but you are young, you can undo ever so much of the past. I know how to do it, and I can tell you the only way. You want God. You must have his power with you all the time. It is the only way to get through this dangerous world. I know I should have died last night or gone mad if I had not had God to hide me. He can hide you, and he will do it. Listen to this. In the fear of the Lord is strong confidence, and his children shall have a place of refuge. Think of that shall. How strong it is. God's shall. That is what you need. That is what you are looking for. I can show you how to find it. Think of walking these streets in strong confidence that no one can touch you, because God has his strength wrapped all about you. John, you have tried it, and you know that human strength will not do. Here is God's strength waiting for you, and the way is so easy. Get down on your knees here with me, and just say, 'God, for Christ's sake, take me, hide me in that place of refuge.' He promised it, so he will never refuse you. Just a word, and the thing is done. You don't know about it, what a strength there is and a power, but you will. He can't save you unless you want to be saved, and are willing to let him do it." He had never heard such words before from his wife. In their earlier years she had been gentle and shrinking, and during the later bitter experiences of life she had been cowed and sullen. Now she was calm and resolute, and as sure, apparently, of the rock on which she rested, as though it had been visible granite under her feet. It was no new story to this well-taught man; he had forgotten it long ago, but the memories of early years came trooping up to him, verse after verse of promise, pleading, warning, came and knocked at his heart. Never was there a fiercer battle waged with Satan for a soul than went on in that room that night, where the shades were drawn close for the first time. The hours passed, and the gray dawn of another morning began to creep over the world. In the little room they did not know it, for the shades were heavy and the lamp burned brightly still. At the back door in the kitchen there came a low tap. Miss Hunter went on tiptoe and set the door ajar. The knocker was Mr. Cleveland. "We saw him come in," he murmured, "and he certainly has not gone out again. I thought perhaps I ought to come and see if help were needed." Miss Hunter stepped out into the frosty air and closed the door behind her. Even with this precaution she bent forward and spoke in a whisper. "Mr. Cleveland, he prayed. I heard his voice, and I heard the first words. Then I stopped my ears, for I knew that they ought to be alone with God. I believe he is a saved man. I don't like to disturb them, but the fire must be getting low, and pretty soon they ought to have some breakfast." The prosaic and the eternities mingling! Yet while the flesh enfolds us, what are we to do without the prosaic? God bless the souls who, capable of rising to the heights which belong to immortality, yet think of fire and breakfast. Mr. Cleveland made one more call before he took his breakfast. Kate was up and dressed, and looking out of the south window, with the first streaks of morning sunlight glinting over her. She did not stop for his knock, but came to the door silent, waiting. He held out his hand to her, smiling. "Do you remember an old story which ran thus? 'Inquire in the house of Judas for one called Saul of Tarsus, for behold he prayeth?' History has repeated itself. If you inquire for one John Hartzell, behold he prayeth. That is the last word I have had of him, not 10 minutes ago. Kate, God has come down to us, and stretched out his hand of power, and supplemented our weakness. Now you and I, with this token of what he is willing to do, must join hands and reach out to him in behalf of the perishing world. Can we work together, Kate?" And then Miss Wainwright came to the door. "I heard the first words," she said, "and went back to thank the Lord. Now you two may come in and have some breakfast. It is early, but somehow it seemed to me that a good breakfast would be needed here this morning, so I got up early and looked after it." And once more the eternities and the blessed prosaics met. End of Chapter 31. End of One Commonplace Day by Pansy. Recording by Trisha G.